We're delighted to have you with us this afternoon. First off, I want to thank Northrop Grumman for its support, and to Rebecca Hersman and the Project on Nuclear Issues here at CSIS for bringing together such a distinguished and diverse set of scholars today for this conversation on the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. One of PONI, the Project on Nuclear Issues' primary goals, is to promote a range of voices in the nuclear community, and especially to bring forward new voices. We hope that today's events will help showcase a broad set of opinions and backgrounds. We're delighted to have John Rood here, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, to help us kick off the event. I'll introduce him in a moment. Then we will have two panel discussions, one looking at the new policies and capabilities proposed in the NPR, and a second examining the regional impact of the NPR, especially in Europe and in North Asia. To conclude, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Mac Thornberry, will be here with our CEO, John Hamre. Congressman Thornberry will deliver a keynote address, and then he will have a discussion with John Hamre. Today's event is on the record. It is being webcast, and the video will be available on the CSIS website after today. We're also live tweeting from our CSIS Project on Nuclear Issues account. That is at CSIS PONI. We hope you tweet along with us. I will not actually be tweeting, but tweet along with others. And we are using the hashtag CSIS Live for this event. As a convener, we always have a duty to remind you of the safety precautions of the building. There are exits behind me, exits behind you. I'm here with you throughout the first part, and Rebecca Hersman is throughout the rest of the time, and we are the people to look for should a fire alarm or something go off. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Rood, who is our first keynote speaker. He will provide some opening remarks, and then I'm going to join him for some back and forth before we open it to the audience. I will let you know he has, as is often the case in his job, he has been pulled back to DOD for a meeting with the Secretary of Defense following this, so I will keep my portion of this quite short, hoping to get a few questions from you all in before he will have to depart directly from here back to the Pentagon. The Honorable John C. Rood serves as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, where he brings more than 3 decades of public and private sector experience. Relevant to today's discussion, during his time in government, he has worked on a broad range of nuclear weapons issues, ranging from non-proliferation, counter-proliferation, multilateral export controls, missile defense, forces policy, and many other issues. In his over 20 years of service in the U.S. government, he has gained experience across the interagency, with time spent at the Department of State, Department of Defense, National Security Council, Central Intelligence Agency, and as a staff member in the U.S. Senate. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Rood.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Rebecca, for having me here today at this beautiful facility on a great day. As I looked around the crowd who've come here today, it's always a little bit intimidating before you give some of these talks to see some of the big brains who I have tried to learn from, like Frank Miller, and Corey is here, and of course to see Elaine Bunn and a number of others. So I will try to impart some things perhaps that might be new from the Nuclear Posture Review. But I did want to say up front, this is a unique period to be here also, following some of the events of the last week, where our parties around the world, President Putin giving a very noteworthy speech yesterday that I think frames the context for today's discussion very well. And I regret I won't be able to stay for the day. I think you've got a great lineup of speakers, and quite a plum to have Chairman Thornberry coming. Now, with respect to the Nuclear Posture Review, that was one of the first things. In fact, it was President Trump's first national security presidential memorandum that he issued. And that underscores, I think, his belief that the security environment is very different that we face today, and that matters like our nuclear deterrent were things that we needed to urgently look at in the context of that new security environment. So what happened is the Defense Department conducted a very deliberate, intelligence-based review of what our nuclear posture needed to be, tried to make this as comprehensive as possible, and to do it alongside the Departments of State and Energy, as well as in further consultation with our allies and partners around the world, to really look at what did our nuclear posture need to be, how did we need to review our practices to make it fully consistent with that environment that we face today. And much has changed. Of course, but many things haven't. Some of the things that haven't, there have been several nuclear posture reviews that have been done in the past, and this nuclear posture review was broadly consistent with those in a number of ways, but there are some important differences that I want to point out as we go through this. I will also say there were two other major reviews that were done by the Trump administration early on, one for a new national security strategy and another for a national defense strategy. Both of those have been completed, and this NPR is, of course, very consistent with them. The thing that those broader strategy documents articulated is the way that the security environment has substantially changed in the last couple of decades. The national security strategy properly characterizes that environment as having the reemergence of great power competition. I think during my lifespan, this is certainly the most complex and difficult security environment that we've faced. It's interesting to me is when I say that, people say, well, of course that's the case. And I think in a lot of ways that underscores just how much that has changed from when we might have stood here 10 years ago or 15 or another period of time. Now, the national security strategy talked about revisionist behavior from both China and Russia and the security concerns that arise from that, provocations and the challenge we face from other countries like North Korea and Iran, and then the persistent threat we face from violent extremist organizations. Certainly not a return to a bipolar Cold War, but a much different situation that exists with the great power competition being not as simple as that existed during the Cold War. The nuclear posture review characterized some of the change dynamics from the last nuclear posture review in 2010, in particular in Russia. Since 2010, Russia has altered its military doctrine to state that NATO was its top threat, a position it reiterated in 2014. That same year, Russia invaded Ukraine and used military force to attempt to change long-established borders in Europe. Rather than reducing the salience of nuclear weapons, Russian leaders have made explicit nuclear threats and have brandished these weapons in a way we haven't seen in some time. Russia is actively modernizing and expanding its strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons, stockpiles, and capabilities. And Russian officials, including President Putin, Defense Minister Shoigu, the Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, have declared that nearly 80% of Russia's strategic nuclear forces have now been modernized. While Russia appears to be adhering to its obligations under the New START Treaty, it is widening the sizable gap between its deployed strategic nuclear forces and our own, deployed non-nuclear strategic arsenal and our own, despite the variety and numbers of Russia's non-strategic nuclear capabilities that they have developed and tested. They also fielded the SSC-8 ground-launched cruise missile, which violates the INF Treaty. And this is while they're also violating other treaties like the Open Skies Treaty and the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. While the United States is open to further arms control discussions, as we have had for some time, we can't help but come to the conclusion that based on some of these actions, we don't have a willing partner in these reductions in the Russian Federation. Just as concerning as Russia's behavior in the arms control arena is the modernization program they've taken and then their views on the role of nuclear weapons. General Breedlove, Philip Breedlove, who was the former commander of Supreme Allied Powers in Europe, said recently, and I quote, "NATO policymakers and planners must recognize that their Russian counterparts view nuclear weapons as practical tools for gaining tactical advantage on the battlefield, escalation control, and for intimidation during conflict termination," end quote. Now, what's going on with Russia is concerning enough, but when we add China into the equation, our concerns, of course, grow. And while these are very different challenges with different countries in different parts of the world, and certainly not seen as two parts of a whole, they do reinforce our concerns what's happening separately in different parts of the world. China has threatened the U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region with disputes over territorial boundaries and claims to contested islands. China continues to expand its nuclear capabilities in both quality and quantity. Since 2010, it's announced the development or fielded new road mobile multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle systems, ICBMs I should say, theater-range ballistic missiles, a new submarine-launched ballistic missile, a new ballistic missile submarine to carry that missile, and the H-6K strategic bomber. China's lack of transparency regarding the scope and scale of its nuclear modernization leaves the United States and the international community with a lot of concerns about their future intent. I will say from my past service in government, the last time that I visited China in 2008 for strategic stability talks, one of the things that was noteworthy to me was, at that time I served as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the State Department, was that while the purpose of the talks was to show transparency and to examine some of the practices of our respective parties as a confidence-building measure in order to lower our concerns, I think I'd characterize the views of our Chinese hosts as not seeing transparency and the willingness to discuss those things as being in their interest. There is, of course, a line from Sun Tzu where he talks about concealing your strengths and concealing your weaknesses from your adversaries. And I guess I'd say I'd characterize the Chinese approach they took with us at that time as very consistent with Sun Tzu's teachings there. And so it was very difficult, I think, to achieve the purpose of that stability. And if I fast forward now a decade later, I think that trend has continued, unfortunately. In addition to Russia and China, then, if we talk about other countries, of course, North Korea comes to the top of the list. North Korea has repeatedly made explicit nuclear threats to the United States and our allies in the region. Having watched some of the North Korean-produced animation and seen some of the other activities, it's hard to come away with the conclusion that they don't want to send a message to the United States about their intentions. Since Kim Jong-un assumed power in 2011, he has rapidly increased the pace of the development and testing of nuclear devices and of theater, intercontinental, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. In addition to North Korea, Iran remains a concern. While its nuclear ambitions remain, and we remain a party to the joint JCPOA agreement intended to limit those capabilities, we still retain sizable concerns about Iran's ambitions in this regard. In addition to its nuclear program, its ballistic missile program violates UN Security Council resolutions, and its malign activities, of course, are a problem for its neighbors as well as the broader Middle East due to the hegemonic nature of these intentions from Iran. Since 2010 and the NPR that was conducted at that time, therefore, Russia, China, and North Korea have all increased the numbers, capabilities, and salience of their nuclear weapons. And rather than reducing the prospects for reducing the prospects for military confrontation and reassuring and stabilizing their regions, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran have engaged in military aggression and coercive threats against their neighbors. In the United States, our attempts to reduce the numbers and salience of nuclear weapons in the world have not been reciprocated. Of course, this isn't a unique conclusion of the 2018 NPR, but it's something that's shared by our allies and friends around the world and a number of former administration officials, including those of the last administration. In contrast to the actions of some of these potential adversaries, the United States has built no new types of nuclear weapons or delivery systems other than the F-35 fighter, which has multiple roles, for the past 2 decades. We have instead sustained our nuclear deterrent with life extension programs, keeping systems and platforms that were not intended to be in service this long in the service of our forces for several decades beyond their design service life. Former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter rightly observed that if there is an arms race underway, the United States is clearly not a participant. The 2018 NPR responds to this environment with a number of recommendations. The 2018 NPR does not change longstanding tenets of nuclear policy that have bipartisan support, such as the triad, the modernization and recapitalization of programs of record. Our commitment to our treaty obligations remains, and our openness to further arms control reductions with good faith partners is also in place. Instead, the policy and posture recommendations in the NPR contribute to the effective deterrence of potential adversaries and the assurance of allies in a more challenging threat environment. Given its extensive continuity with mainstream U.S. nuclear policy, how then does the 2018 NPR address the new security environment? One, we would argue it clarifies and prioritizes our nuclear posture and policy. And secondly, it recommends those capabilities needed to enable us to have a tailored approach, a tailored set of capabilities to provide an approach to deterrence that will correct adversary miscalculations and thereby effectively reinforce deterrence. In terms of the roles and policy changes there, first, the 2018 NPR reaffirms that deterrence of nuclear attack against the United States and our allies and partners is the top priority of our U.S. nuclear policy. Given the dynamically changing security environment, reemphasizing deterrence as the top objective is a prudent, realistic, and necessary action. Secondly, the NPR clarifies U.S. nuclear declaratory policy. The declaratory policy makes clear that the United States would consider the use of nuclear weapons only in response to extreme circumstances that threaten our vital interests, as stated as well in the 2010 NPR. The 2018 NPR more clearly specifies that a, quote, significant strategic attack could be nuclear or non-nuclear. Of course, there's nothing automatic about a prospective U.S. nuclear response. It will be shaped by the context, that is to say, the extreme circumstances and strategic effect of the adversary attack, and that will govern our responses. This clarification does not expand the circumstances for nuclear use, nor lower the nuclear threshold, as unfortunately some commentators have wrongly suggested. Rather, it enhances deterrence and seeks to raise the nuclear threshold by reducing the potential for adversary miscalculation. This policy is not only consistent with the 2010 NPR, which acknowledged a role for nuclear weapons in deterring select non-nuclear attacks, but is broadly consistent with the policy of every administration from President Truman forward. Third, the 2018 NPR recommends two supplemental programs to strengthen U.S. capabilities to deter attack and assure allies. The first is a modification of a small number of existing submarine-launched ballistic missiles to include a low-yield option. Second is the pursuit of a nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. Neither of these capabilities is new or requires nuclear testing. The low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missiles involve a relatively low-cost modification to an existing warhead. The sea-launched cruise missile is a capability that the United States possessed for decades until it was recently retired. Both capabilities are fully consistent with our treaty obligations. The goal of the 2018 NPR's capability recommendations is to tailor a U.S. deterrence strategy to contemporary requirements. Effective deterrence must shape potential adversaries' calculations to ensure that they do not see the employment of nuclear weapons as a useful option in any circumstance. Given what we've observed in the doctrine, exercises, statements, and threats of other nuclear states since 2010, the challenge of the 2018 NPR was to determine how best to convince potential adversaries that the United States and its allies will not be coerced or paralyzed by their threats of use of nuclear weapons. So let me talk about how these two capabilities will, we think, enhance deterrence. The low-yield SLBM option in that area, Russia's doctrine and military exercises involve the use of a limited amount of nuclear strikes to quickly end a conflict on terms that they believe will be favorable to them. Moscow may mistakenly believe that we lack a credible deterrent to limited low-yield nuclear weapons, limited use of low-yield nuclear weapons. The NPR recommends a low-yield ballistic missile because it will help preclude any potential adversary from believing that its use of low-yield nuclear weapons would allow it to escalate its way out of a conventional conflict. Of course, we have low-yield nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal today, but they're exclusively air-delivered. A low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile is a survivable, prompt option that enhances deterrence by holding at risk targets that may in the future be beyond the reach of our current air-delivered low-yield options. This measured modification to our deterrent will help dispel any adversary expectation of advantage via nuclear first use based on a mistaken belief that the U.S. response options are not credible. These low-yield warheads, because they would be modification to existing weapons, would not add to our overall number of strategic ballistic missiles or the number of nuclear weapons in the U.S. nuclear arsenal, both of which will stay within the New START limits. With respect to the new sea-launched cruise missile, whereas the low-yield ballistic missile launched from a submarine is a near-term economical enhancement of our deterrent, the sea-launched cruise missile would allow us broader flexibility over the longer term to tailor our activities to the deterrent effect that we needed in a particular context. The 2018 NPR calls for the study of a nuclear SLCM, or sea-launched cruise missile, because its characteristics will help us meet these emerging deterrence requirements without having to match Russian non-strategic nuclear capabilities weapon for weapon. Of course, Russia maintains an arsenal of thousands of non-strategic nuclear weapons. And although NATO's 2012 Deterrence and Defense Review reiterated our willingness to pursue reciprocal non-strategic nuclear weapons reductions, Russia has been unwilling to do so. The sea-launched cruise missile is also treaty compliant with the INF Treaty, and it will enhance our reassurance of our European allies in the face of the ground-launched cruise missile that Russia has recently deployed in violation of the INF Treaty. So in conclusion, let me just say that these two capabilities recommended by the 2018 NPR strengthen the deterrence of war and strengthen our assurance of allies, thereby helping to ensure that nuclear weapons are not employed in the future. These capabilities are tailored to the strategic environment that we now face in order to raise the threshold for nuclear use and to do so with minimal changes to the U.S. nuclear posture. Let me be clear here. The goal of our recommendation is to deter war and not to fight one. If nuclear weapons are employed in conflict because deterrence failed, and the goal of the NPR is to make sure that deterrence will not fail, we also want to make sure that we retain credible capabilities in that unlikely eventuality. Strengthening deterrence is not simply a matter of nuclear capabilities. It's also about having the ability to work with friends and allies to reassure them and to create credible options to provide for their collective defense. So our cooperation with friends and allies will ensure that potential adversaries can have no doubt about the cohesion, determination, and alliance capabilities we possess to deter and maintain our common security. In an era of renewed great power competition, adversaries, allies, and the American people should know that the United States has the will and the flexible, resilient nuclear forces needed to protect the peace. So thank you again for giving me the chance to talk to you. I'd be happy to take any questions you have in the Q&A session.
Well, thank you so much. I know we have limited time, so I'm going to keep myself to one question and then go two to the audience, and then I think we can get you on, keep you on schedule. So as we talked about before you came on stage, obviously President Putin came out within the last 24 hours with his own thoughts about Russian nuclear capability, and I would love to just get your reflections on what he said and how the U.S. and the American public should be thinking about where the Russians are going in terms of what they claim to be expanding nuclear capability.
Well, certainly President Putin's remarks yesterday were very noteworthy. But they're not the only remarks that Russian officials have made in the public domain in recent years. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about the information age is, at least the information age as it pertains to the availability of information in this town is very good. But most of our commentators don't read foreign media sources still. And so when you look through some of the Russian language media, you do see a much greater prevalence of these kinds of comments. And so while President Putin certainly gave a very full-throated explanation, I think there were elements of his comments that have been present for some time in various places and different comments that he and others have made before. So I was not surprised by much of the content of that. Nonetheless, it is concerning, the direction that's going on in Russia. Certainly the direction of the country, and a number of us over the years have work to find ways to build a closer relationship between the United States and Russia. But I think as our national security strategy and the national defense strategy said, we're in an era of great power competition again, and Russia has clearly chosen that as an approach. Number of the capabilities that President Putin talked about and an openness of talking about them being oriented at the United States and oriented at the United States and our allies is very noteworthy. That intention and that focus is not merely articulated in that speech, of course. Some of the large-scale Russian exercises that have been conducted that identify NATO and the United States as that which is being exercised against is certainly another indicator of concern. And then we do see capabilities being developed and maintained by the Russians that concern us as well. And so I think we just have to take that into account in terms of the orientation of the country, the demonstrating of capabilities, seeing capabilities developed or maintained as we develop our doctrine. And Russian nuclear doctrine continues to emphasize the use of nuclear weapons in a way that U.S. doctrine in the past has not. And some of the moves that we have taken, Russia has gone in the opposite direction with respect to, for instance, the size of their so-called non-strategic nuclear forces. So all of these things paint a picture that is of concern. And that's really what animated the Nuclear Posture Review's recommendations, that there are, in order to preserve deterrence, to have a flexible set of capabilities for this much more complex world, we needed to make some adjustments to what we were doing in the United States, and some of the recommendations for capabilities, such as the submarine-launched ballistic missile, spring from that consideration.
Great. Okay, I promised 2 audience questions, so I'll take one here and one there. So I'll start here. And we'll do 1, 2, and then let you answer because we are short on time.
Yeah.
Please, the microphone.
Sure.
Your name and
Jonathan
affiliation.
Granoff. I'm the chair of the American Bar Association's International Law Section Task Force on Nuclear Nonproliferation and the president of the Global Security Institute. What I noted in the NPR was that an absence of reference to a pathway to fulfill Article 6 of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, and I wonder if you could address that, since, you know, as lawyers, and we consider that the value that we're defending is the rule of law. And the second is to discuss the compliance with the deployment of our arsenal with international humanitarian law, which I also noted was absent in the NPR.
Thanks, and we'll take the second question, and you can answer them together.
Thanks. Hi, Aaron Mehta with Defense News.
Hi, Aaron.
Just wanted to clarify your statement about kind of the technology that was unveiled by President Putin last night. So obviously the S-6 was in the NPR, was called out specifically, but the hypersonic weapons weren't. Certainly the nuclear-powered cruise missile that he talked about wasn't called out in the NPR. So how aware has the Pentagon been about these technology developments, which have, according to President Putin, been tested over the last several months? And how much did that directly influence the final form the NPR took?
Great.
Okay. Maybe I'll just take them in turn.
Absolutely.
You know, on the first question, the NPR reaffirms the longstanding U.S. commitment to our arms control obligations and our willingness to engage in those type of activities going forward in terms of new negotiations. So I wouldn't say that we see it as signaling a change in the longstanding practice that we've had in the United States. With respect to Article 6, I would also say everything in the NPR is fully consistent with that view. Bear in mind, number one, the Nuclear Posture Review does not increase the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. We have reduced the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal by 85% in recent decades. Now, I would say, as Ash Carter, former Secretary of Defense, brought up, other countries like Russia and China have gone in the other direction. North Korea has gone in the other direction. Our willingness to engage in those reductions has not been reciprocated by others in the world. So I think I would say our actions, our words have been fully consistent with the obligations in Article 6. And as you know, Article 6 doesn't merely speak to the role of nuclear weapons. It talks about good faith negotiations towards nuclear disarmament in the context of general and complete disarmament.
We are not going to have enough time. I'm sorry. I'll have to wait for another day for the follow-on. And to the question over here.
Oh,
in
Aaron's
terms of
question. Well, Aaron, certainly I wouldn't characterize our intelligence in public about various things, but I would say our concern about Russia's capabilities, our concern about Russia's direction, and some of the statements that have been made in the past about the role of nuclear weapons predated President Putin's speech yesterday. And, you know, as I said, I personally was not surprised to see a number of his comments in that speech. I think it's broadly consistent with things that have been stated before from Russian officials. That doesn't mean I welcome it or, or that it was necessarily the message that we would have liked to have received, but I think it's broadly consistent with things that the Russian government has said in the past.
And I greatly regret we have hit your time limit, but I'm extremely appreciative, given your tight schedule today, you made the time to come over here to talk publicly about the NPR, and I know the follow-on panels will dig into a lot of these issues. Please join me in thanking Undersecretary Rood for his time today.
Thank you.
Very good. It looks like we're about ready to get back started. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, I'm Rebecca Hersman. I'm the Director of the Project on Nuclear Issues here at CSIS, and very pleased to welcome you all here today. It was terrific to have John Rood, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, to come and kick things off and kind of give a very good laydown of the basics of the nuclear posture review and some of the key issues, both in terms of what was driving concern behind the review, what was sort of driving some of the policy, where it stays the same, where it might change, and making the case for some of the changes that are reflected in the review. So next we'll move into our panel. I will remind the group, in case there are any new arrivers, that we are live tweeting, and so hashtag CSIS Live. We are on the record. The event is being recorded and live streamed, so you'll have an opportunity to see it a second time in case once isn't enough. But we are welcoming those who are watching online as we speak. I want to again mention our appreciation to Northrop Grumman for doing so much to help make this event possible. We were very appreciative of that. What I'm going to do in this panel is we're going to have a conversation and talk about some of the issues that have been coming up, mostly focused on some of the issues of clear policy and capability. In our next panel, we'll talk a bit more of the regional perspectives, both in terms of our perspectives on key regional threats, as well as how we think the review has been received in critical regions. But for now, we're going to focus on some of the nuts and bolts, including those capabilities and policies. We will, in part, think about what's changed and what's the same, but we're going to get past that and talk about what's important, because I think that's perhaps the more important question. Let me just offer a brief introduction. So to my left, we have Franklin Miller. He's a principal at the Scowcroft Group. He was a special assistant to President George W. Bush and a senior director for defense policy and arms control at the National Security Council. He spent 31 years in government, including 22 years in the Department of Defense under 7 different secretaries. He currently serves on the Defense Policy Board and the U.S. Strategic Command Advisory Group. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a director at the Atlantic Council. Next, to my right, we have Ms. Elaine Bunn, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy. She directed the offices of the Undersecretary for Policy that develop and review departmental and national policies for nuclear and missile defense capabilities. And prior to that, she was a Distinguished Research Fellow in the Center for the Strategic Studies at National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies. She also had a very long and successful career in government in the Department of Defense. So we're very grateful that you have joined us for this. To my farther right, we have Dr. Adam Mount, who is a senior fellow and the director of the Defense Posture Project at the Federation of American Scientists. His work covers U.S. nuclear strategy and force structure, global nuclear politics, deterrence, and North Korea. He was previously a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a Stanton Nuclear Fellow at CFR. So we have a lot of expertise up here to discuss the issues, so I think we should just kind of dig in. So what I wanted to do first is talk about the new capabilities. And because I think that really is the biggest part of the review. So why don't we just kind of dive right into what everyone wants to talk about anyway. So the two sea-launched capabilities in terms of the D5 Trident modification as well as the SLCM. So I have at least one significant question to ask, but we can ask each other. For me, one of the biggest questions is, why do we need this capability in addition to those capabilities that were already resident, in particular in our air leg. We have always had lower yield capabilities. Why do we actually need additional ones, and from a different platform? Why is that essential? And how do we sort of want to think about that going forward? And a related question I'd like you to touch on is, to what extent should we be concerned about the emphasis on this big gap that's being filled as actually undermining those other capabilities that we already have as part of the core program? So if we could maybe start with that. Do you want to go first, Frank?
Set up like a bowling pin. So sure. So I think the first concern that the NPR evinces in this area is that over the past 10 to 15 years, in the face, and this is I think the most important point, in the face of existing triad capabilities and capabilities in Europe, the DCA, we have the Russian doctrine declared in various different ways, but that would use nuclear weapons to defeat a NATO force, which would be defending and presumably retaking NATO territory. We have the fact that they have the weapons to back that up, and we have the fact that they've exercised it. And they did all of that in the face of current capabilities. And so the judgment was that the Russian military leadership perceives a gap, and that the gap would be an ability to have a prompt, indisputably able to penetrate any defense system that would allow the United States to respond with a low-yield nuclear weapon, which is to say, to deter Russian use of nuclear weapons in the first place. This is clearly not a battlefield weapon. We do not want to indicate any willingness to fight a battlefield nuclear war. So yes, is this escalatory? Right. It says, don't cross the line. Don't use nuclear weapons first, because we will have a capability very soon at very low cost that doesn't add any additional weapons to our stockpile that can be used to escalate in response to Russian first use on the battlefield. And I think your other point is, does it detract from what we're doing in the triad generally? The answer is no. I mean, deterrence evolves as the threat evolves. This is the first point. The second point is, this is a tailored response to a perceived problem. The triad and its other capabilities and the DCA in Europe respond to a wide variety of other contingencies. But that, I believe, is the rationale, and it's the rationale in which I believe for the low-yield D5, which, again, will be bought in very small numbers.
Why don't we stick with the D5 first, if you think. Were you going to switch that up?
Well,
to
no,
the
I was
Slickum?
just going to talk about your question about why aren't the other lower yield options in our capability toolkit sufficient? And are they, aren't they? That's a judgment call, but there are some differences. Everything that we have now, as it points out, I think as John Rood pointed out, that we have that is lower yield is in the air leg. Air leg is not always an appropriate, is not always feasible or appropriate for either potential use, and potential use gets to deterrence. What does the other guy think that you would do, the whole back and forth of what do they perceive that we perceive that they perceive. Or actual use if it's a response to someone else's limited use of nuclear weapons. So why isn't air delivered always the right response to something like that, or the way to deter that? Well, because in the presence of lots of air defenses, he may think you're not going to get through. He may think that you think you may not get through. If you have to overfly places that you either don't want to or don't have permission to get there. If there's a need for the SLBM, if there's a need for prompt lower yield, aircraft are not prompt. But again, those are just the what ifs, and again, it comes down to the judgment call about what does he think that we think that they think, based on what we've seen.
I think that's exactly the question that we should be discussing here. And in particular, we should be looking at how does this new US policy reflect to Russia how we're thinking about their strategy and how we think about the credibility of our own options. So for example, if there's a credibility issue with the air leg, I think we should be thinking seriously about whether it's worth spending the money to do the B-61 production line, and whether that is still a credible option. I think we should be talking seriously about LRSO. There might be a case to be made here where the LYD-5 can replace some of these other capabilities if, in fact, they are outdated. But my broader concern is that the language in the Nuclear Posture Review and in some associated statements from senior officials seems to validate Russia's arguments about the utility of low-yield nuclear weapons. So, for example, if this is a mistaken perception that the United States does not have credible lower-yield options for a limited war, then why are we scrambling to validate that perception? Why are we scrambling to fill a gap that we don't believe exists? In my judgment, that just buys into Russia's mistaken theory here. And the better solution would be to project confidence in U.S. Deterrent capabilities. To say, for example, across our joint force, including conventional forces and other cross-domain responses, we have the capability to respond to any aggression or any provocation the Russians throw at us. I think that's far more stabilizing and a far more, a far stronger statement of U.S. resolve than it is to try to scramble to fill a gap that we don't believe exists.
But we do. I mean, that's the point. We do believe the gap exists. We believe the Russian military has decided that we don't have a capability to respond. And so, as the NPR says, we're trying to correct this misperception on the part of the Russians and to raise the threshold and to convince Putin that whatever the military says about using nuclear weapons first is a bad idea. We believe this gap exists. And if you look at even what Ash Carter was saying a couple of years ago, at the potential for first use in the 21st century is not massive, but Russian use against a NATO conventional defense, that's acknowledging that we have concerns about what the Russians are thinking.
I wanted to come back to your question about if you think you need a sea-launched cruise missile, then maybe you need to rethink B-61 and LRSO. I mean, that, again, when I was talking about what is it that air launch don't have, there were a lot of ifs. So in some situations, aircraft may be exactly what you need to deter, to assure, to fly over South Korea, to do other things. Right. So there's so many things that the same nuclear force, at least 3 different nuclear armed potential adversaries that you're talking about, and you almost have to say, well, what's its utility here? What situations can I speculate about that we don't know how that might come to be, but so it's 3 different kinds of nuclear armed countries at this point, and then assuring allies, and so aircraft for that does have, I think, a big role.
But the yield itself, and these options seems to be sold in terms of having a redundant way of delivering a similar yield. And so I think we need to ask if, as Frank says, the argument is we see Russia building certain systems in certain ways and posturing them in certain ways, that's alarming to us. And we use those developments to impute upon them certain intentions. Is the argument that the LYD-5 is going to be just the specific system we need to get them to cease those modernization efforts? Or do we really believe that this will be sufficient to cause Russia to abandon these theories? I think we need to think very carefully about that.
So let me pull it from there. I mean, I think this sort of way I look at it when we think about the capability and how, the case for it, right. It kind of has these 3 pieces to it. One is necessity, which is really what we were just talking about. How critical is this? Why do we have to have it? What is the need? I mean, there's clearly some debate there. I think there's 2 others. I'm going to go to the second one, but just to forecast. The second one in my mind is applicability, and I'll explain what I mean. And the third is practicality. In other words, we might think you need it. You might think it's the perfect thing, but if it costs even more money or other things, right? There might be reasons why it's not practical. Mm-hmm. And I think some of the political environment we're in might raise a couple of practicality questions. But let's go back to applicability. that is the bucket, I think, where there's been quite a lot of debate that I'd love to hear your views on. And I think where there's been a great sort of series of pieces in War on the Rocks. We had Vipin Narang's piece, we had Austin Long, they were talking about the role of D5. Frank, you've weighed in the last couple of days. So let me just hit the three big challenges about does this apply. First is the operational challenge. This is the evasion issue. Is this some big operational risk or not, and why? The second one being this discrimination, quote unquote discrimination risk. Is it going to get confused for the wrong thing and cause something unintended to happen? And then the third one is the usability threshold altering challenge. So to what extent are we increasing rather than decreasing the risks of war? If I sort of got at least the three issues there, right? So let's touch on that. Frank, why don't you go ahead and kick off?
Sure. So let's start from the back first. Usability. People impute to the proposal that the United States wants to have usable nuclear weapons. And one of the charges was that the NPR calls for more usable nuclear weapons. The NPR, if you read the NPR, says exactly the opposite, that we are not seeking usable nuclear weapons, that we don't believe in usable nuclear weapons. And read what the words say. If you want to consider this a complete and total bald-faced lie, that's people's right in a democracy. But that's not what the NPR says. The operational question, which is roughly framed as if an SSBN fires one missile, the enemy will find it and sink it immediately, is an argument made by people who simply do not understand submarine operations. First of all, for 40 years, since the mid-70s, we've had limited nuclear options in our policy and plans. SSBNs would carry limited nuclear options. So for 40 years, we have had the capability and the plan, if executed, to fire small numbers of missiles from an SSBN. So the first thing is this is not a new development. The second thing, and I tried to make this clear, I made this clear in my piece. What are the assumptions? Do you believe the US SSBN is being trailed by a Russian submarine? If you believe that, the SSBN's mission's been compromised from the beginning, so you can write that one off, right? That's got nothing to do with an SLBM single launch or not. We don't believe we can be trailed, okay? Full stop. The second is, are the oceans about to be transparent? If you want to assume the oceans are transparent, this is a different discussion. The laws of physics haven't changed, however, yet. So then it's, how do you sink the submarine? Missile comes up out of the water, say an infrared satellite picks it up. It tells a command center in Moscow to shoot an ICBM at it. 20 minutes later, some warheads hit the area, right? Not clear that anybody has RVs that will hit the water and sink to depth and go off, that will survive the flight time and G-forces of an ICBM RV. In those 20 minutes, the SSBN can create a circle of uncertainty with a diameter of 13 miles. And since I did the math and I remembered pi r squared, that's 137 square miles of ocean to boil, okay? Now, since you're going to have to use more than 6 RVs or 7 RVs to do that, let's say you have to use 10 or 15 ICBMs. That's going to give you another 10 minutes. In that extra 10 minutes, your area of uncertainty is 314 square miles. Go ahead and boil the ocean. You can't do that, right? There aren't enough RVs. The last question is, if the United States launched 1 or 2 Trident missiles at Russia, wouldn't the Russians react and expend their entire force? Well, that's a possibility. The whole point of deterrence is threatening escalation, to say a situation is going to get out of control, so Mr. Putin, do not use a nuclear weapon first. But as I said, for 40 years, we have had the capability, and we have had in our plans the idea that there could be small options. And some of us in this room have helped build those small options. Would the Russians absolutely say, that's a small option, there are only 2 coming at us, and let's wait? Who knows? But that's why deterrence is so important. But I think the point is, none of this is new. If you don't like small options, that's fine. Say you don't like small options. That's not an argument against a D5 low yield.
Just one little pushback. And I don't know that it would be so much on the actual point about lowering the threshold, but just to clarify where I think the debate is, I don't think there's a debate over what the NPR says, or that it says it would recommend any kind of lowering, or that is in any way the intention of any kind. I think the debate is in whatever logic that unfolds inside the brains of various people, is that what is the risk of that as the unintended consequence? I just don't think this is one of these, same different arguments about the words of the document. I think it's a disagreement over the
But the whole argument
theory
that you're making jumps into sort of phase 2 of the game, which is the Russians have already used a nuclear weapon, and what are we going to do? Mm-hmm. Phase 1 of the game is to make certain that the Russian political leadership understands not to use a nuclear weapon in the first place. These are deterrent and responsive weapons. This is not calling for a first-use weapon, right? And so therefore, it is not lowering the threshold on our part. It's trying to make the Putin administration decide they're not going to use a nuclear weapon, and therefore to raise the threshold.
Well, and I think one of the we need to unpack what the assumptions are when people say lower the threshold. And it's a real question. Are they envisioning it lowers the threshold for U.S. first nuclear use, or is it lowers the threshold for U.S. response to somebody else's use of nuclear weapons? And so, and talking about first use that's a legitimate discussion to have, but just parsing out what do they mean about lowering the nuclear threshold, I would love to. What are the implied assumptions there?
Right, exactly. I think the concern is not always about first use. When folks are worried about lowering the nuclear threshold, and I understand that the NPR says explicitly that that's not what they intend to do. But the NPR also sees that lower yield weapons have increased credibility in certain circumstances. And if that's true, you just simply are expanding your options in certain circumstances for the use of nuclear weapons. That's the theory, right? That you think you need new options for a new set of circumstance. And that's what we worry about when we say lowering the threshold. There's a very real question about what is the stated purpose of nuclear weapons in the nuclear posture review, right? This poorly defined category of non-strategic nuclear attacks has been questioned in public significantly. Does it raise the possibility of a nuclear retaliation for a cyber attack on U.S. civilian infrastructure, for example? There have been competing statements from administration officials about this. And more to the point, President Putin said this morning that he believes that that was the threat that was made. So that's one consideration. Another consideration is, what is this low-yield D5 option for? What are the targets that it brings into view, that the B-61 does not have, or the LRSO does not have? What are the options that it affords us, the new missions that it affords us, that could not be held at risk with existing capabilities? If these are targets on the battlefield meant to achieve a military effect, then that's one question, and it could involve lowering the threshold, even if it's second use. If it's targets, as Frank mentioned in his recent War on the Rocks piece, that pertain to Russian leadership.
I didn't say that. I said targets of importance to the Russian leadership, not the Russian leadership, which is a very key distinction.
No, I did not say that, the leadership itself, but of importance to Russian leadership. I think we need to have a conversation about what those are and why those are appropriate targets in a certain range of scenarios, right? So the question is, are these low-yield nuclear weapons, do they fit in with our current strategic concept, and are they the most effective way of having the precise strategic effect we need to deter low-yield nuclear use? I worry that the nuclear posture review had a handful of nails, and it looked for the best nuclear solution to certain hypothetical scenarios rather than the best solution overall. And that's all of these considerations fold into the worry that it does lower the threshold.
I don't want to.
Do you want to stay on that point?
Well, I think, can we work in the question of the sea-launched cruise missile as well? Because I think I would like to have a little bit of discussion about, even between these two capabilities, what's same, what's different? Are they trying to solve the same problem, trying to solve different problems? Is it just a question of timeline? And do these applicability questions change at all between those two capabilities? So I think I have a few questions about that, but chime in and then be thinking about how to talk about the SLCM.
Point, I mean, LRSO has a role in some contexts. The DCA in Europe have an irreplaceable role with respect to assurance, and keeping 30-year-old weapons there does not mean that we can continue that role much longer. Therefore, there's a reason for the 6112. As a stated policy, we do not intend to signal our willingness to engage in a nuclear war on the battlefield, nor would one choose a D5 system to strike a battlefield target. So the answer is, as it has been from the beginning of the nuclear age, to signal that if an enemy uses nuclear weapons first, we're prepared to escalate. And that means that the world could end, and that the enemy leadership needs to consider not using nuclear weapons in the first place. There are lots of other things we need to do. We need to build up our conventional forces in NATO. We need to build up our command and control systems. But the point is to raise the consequences of Russian first use. I think the sea-launched cruise missile is a different animal. I think the sea-launched cruise missile is all about two things. One, to say to the Russians, you have violated the INF Treaty along with 7 other different arms control treaties. If you don't get back into compliance, we are going to deploy a worldwide capability in the INF range that's treaty compliant. The second, again, and John Rood touched on this briefly, is if you consider the Indo-Pacific region 10 years from now, and you look at the Chinese ICBMs, IRBMs, MRBMs, and their naval and other tactical systems, we may well, not certainly, need some sort of in-theater, widely dispersed nuclear deterrent capability. Now, those are ideas behind the sea-launched cruise missile, which will emerge presumably somewhere in the 2030s. But I think those are two very distinctly different roles. And look, sea-launched cruise missile will be an entirely new project, so that will be more than a couple of pennies. The D5 modification is extremely affordable and can be put in the field in 18 to 24 months.
Okay, I want to come back to some of those practical questions, but Elaine, you've been wanting to get in here.
The arms control aspect is an interesting one that I think Secretary Mattis really emphasized in his testimony in the Hill shortly after the NPR came out. So, I mean, as one of those who's done a lot of, since 1981, negotiations with the Russians, including on INF, they don't give up something for nothing. And so, there was a certain frustration that, gosh, for a lot of years, we knew they had violated, and we talked with them, and they would go, who, me? What missile? What launcher? And so, if this could be an incentive for arms control or for them eliminating their ground-launched cruise missile, the SSC-8, that may be worth the money of a program to look at things. Now, would they actually get rid of theirs without our going all the way to deployment? They didn't with Pershing 2 and Glickham. They may just go all the way to deployment before they got rid of the SS-20. So I don't know. I'm not going to hold my breath, but the arms control leverage of a program to examine a SLCM is, to me, the more interesting aspect of that.
I think that's really important to weigh in on, right? The NPR itself is vague, to say the least, about the military requirement for a new SLCM. If there is a military requirement, then the Navy and the Pentagon ought to make the case for why this specific system is required to fill U.S. deterrent objectives. If it's to be put on the table as a bargaining chip, I think that's a highly speculative theory, right? The Russians deployed SSC-8 in contravention of the INF Treaty in a dramatically irresponsible way. And they did it in full knowledge of the diplomatic costs that they would incur by doing that. It's not clear to me that a speculative program changes their calculus in this regard. it's not clear to me that a fielded SLCM changes their calculus in this regard, that the SLCM is worth the same value for them as an INF missile that we've been worried about for years and can threaten our allies in Europe. But more to the point, I'm worried about treating nuclear modernization as a bargaining chip, right? The Russians today announced 4 new systems that they had not previously discussed explicitly in public, including the Kinzhal, a maneuverable Alchem that could hold at risk targets potentially at INF range, the Avangard, a maneuverable long-range boost glide vehicle. These are extremely expensive systems. And so the Russians are sort of flooding the table with bargaining chips. And if our position is we should be trading off chips, it's not looking good, right? The right way to think about nuclear deterrence for the United States is to say, we have the most capable nuclear arsenal in the world. We have the most capable conventional forces in the world. We will meet our deterrent objectives with whatever levers are most effective. And we're willing to come to the table to do fair deals. We don't have to scramble after the Russians to try to get them to accept a specific deal, especially one that's not very good.
No, but I think that's the point, isn't it? I mean, you said 2 things that are very important. The first is we have the best nuclear forces and best conventional forces in the world. There's no place on the NATO-Russia border where we have superiority. The second point is our deterrent forces are aging. And as the former commander of Strategic Command, Cecil Haney, said, if we don't replace these things soon, we're going to be out of business. So the modernization program is to replace a known quantity and a known capability. The other point that you made is that the Russian, and these programs did not emerge over the last several weeks since the NPR was put on the table. The Russians have been modernizing, expanding their nuclear forces for well over a decade. And that involves an internal Russian dynamic. I'm not going to question that dynamic, but what I am saying is that they certainly walked away from any notion of the Prague speech. And we need to have a modern, credible deterrent precisely because they have these things. We're not going to come up with some of these jackass ideas like an underwater torpedo that's going to salt the earth like Carthage, somewhere between Charlestown, Massachusetts and Charleston, South Carolina, and render the East Coast uninhabitable. Those are stupid things. But what we need to do is modernize our force because the Russians are clearly devoted to active nuclear weapons programs to try to threaten and intimidate the United States and our allies.
But Frank, I think your point about conventional inferiority in theater is very well taken. And I think the critical question facing us is whether the money spent on these systems could be better spent on conventional force readiness, right? If we can do more prepositioned ABCTs that can deploy to the Baltics, improve logistical capability so that we can have the forces there in time to have a decisive effect on the conflict, that's a better deterrent value than is a SLCM that duplicates existing capabilities. And so that's where I think we ought to be putting our money.
But there is a question. I'm gonna bring Elaine in, but I think there is a question of not everything is a choice.
I'm perfectly happy having discussed it.
But not everything is a choice or a zero sum. Some things are additive. So I think that's something to consider. But I do want to come back for a minute to the SLCM before we kind of. I'm going to force the issue a little bit because the SLCM is going to come under a lot of fire in a lot of ways, right? I think I'll be curious to see if it enjoys much support from the Navy and how that really is manifest, because the last version, the TLAM,
eager to get rid of.
Yeah, there was not a lot of enthusiasm there. There've been it's been so many open questions about the SLCM in terms of what it might look like and what it's really for. I think the D5 has been, and obviously because it's a much nearer term capability, much closer in, I think has actually been far more thoroughly explained. But the SLCM is a little more confusing. Is it really a bargaining chip? Is it really a capability? If it's a capability, what is that pathway going to look like? Because if that doesn't get explained, it'll be gone long before its 2030 schedule.
Well, fear not, the department's going to do an analysis of alternatives, which will chew up at least 3 years. And so, you'll have your answers.
All right, but that'll probably be the answer. So let me try to ask a practical question that I'm really curious about. We've actually gotten to the point where this option is being bandied about whether it would be on a surface vessel or whether it would be deployed on a submarine. Right. And related to that opens all kinds of questions about how new would a warhead be, and what would be the requirements, and what types of command and control changes would have to be made. Do any of you think we might be better off by narrowing a few parameters early and trying to make this seem more bounded by some of the inflammatory things?
On what basis do you narrow the perspective, though? I mean, I think that's the purpose of an AOA.
But it might go to my practicality point.
Okay.
Are some of them just so impractical?
Well, probably, but I don't know which they are. I don't happen to know which ones they are.
So Rebecca, I think overall that's exactly the perspective we should be taking to modernization. Which are the core priorities, and which are these supplements? Which, if you read the Nuclear Posture Review, that's the words, that's it, right? So, which are nice to haves and which are core priorities? There's only so much money to go around, and I think if we're interested in building a stable, reliable deterrent, we should be prioritizing the most important systems. And so, right, there are additional operational questions about SLCM. Does it go on surface ships, right? General Hyten mentioned the DDG-1000 at NDU a couple of weeks ago on C-SPAN. There's also this question about whether it goes on SSNs. The SSN fleet is stretched to the boundaries, right? COCOMs are screaming for more SSN coverage, and to pull boats out of the fleet to train those guys, do the cert, do the reconfigurations so that they get this capability, it's hard for me to imagine, and especially without a theory about what it's for. I would need an ironclad theory of why this is absolutely critical and cannot be, these missions cannot be filled with other systems in order to inconvenience and to a trite U.S. conventional readiness like that.
So I
You're
think
right that they have many missions, the submarines do, and so do destroyers.
Sure.
So do surface ships.
Right.
I mean, they've got multiple missions,
Right.
and you don't want, but so do bombers, and so do DCA.
Sure.
I mean, they've been used mostly in the conventional mission. So it is a problem that faces us. The fact that any of our platforms that have many missions,
Right.
it's a good point.
Well, I think
And Frank says we have 20 years to figure it out, too.
No, well, again, I mean, we could argue about this until the cows come home, but the fact is the department's going to do an AO8. It's going to come up with some sort of position, internal and public, and we can assess it then. Right now, we're talking about something that's been brought up as an idea as of February 2nd, and I think it's probably a waste of time to talk about it. We can talk about it as much as you want. It's not going to cost a lot of money. Right now it's not going to cost a lot of money. I think to Adam's other point, I mean, and I'm absolutely in support of building up conventional capabilities, but the whole modernization program now to include the small amount of money for the D5 low yield amounts to 3% of the defense budget. The figure that the NPR talks about is that the entire program costs 6.4% of the defense budget. 3% of that means goes to operating the current force. So now, 3% of the defense budget to modernize the entire triad over 30 years to deter an existential threat, as Ash Carter and Jim Mattis have said, that's a small price to pay to deter an existential threat. It's less than 1% of the federal budget. So I think we can have, and I strongly support the conventional modernization, but this is 3%. The modernization is 3 to 4% of the defense budget. It's easily affordable.
All right, I'm going to go to the frying pan, from the frying pan into the fire. I know we could talk about the whole sort of 3% versus 6% thing. Maybe we'll save that for an audience question. But I want to actually talk about the declaratory policy, because I think that...
You missed discrimination. We didn't, okay.
Oh, we didn't get to discrimination?
We didn't really get to that issue of...
I thought I did that.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Nobody
you
ever
touched on
covers
it.
discrimination.
You guys,
Yeah.
all right.
I don't think so either.
You think we should go back there? All right.
I think we should complete that before
I think you're right. Okay, so get ready. Be thinking about
there has been a lot written about this.
There has been. You're absolutely right.
And so I have two thoughts whenever I read the articles about it. It's okay. One is that if it's a problem, it's an existing problem. We have long had, the Russians have long had, the Chinese have systems that are both conventional and nuclear. air launch, cruise missile, sea launch, cruise missile. So this is not a new problem. The SLBM's not a new problem because of the UK has its own warhead that is a lower yield on the Trident missile, which is the same Trident missile from the same pool as US missiles. I mean, they're all the same Trident missiles. So if it's a problem, it has long been a problem. But that doesn't mean it's not a problem. What really puzzles me is I go, okay, well, wait a minute. It's a problem because what is it that we're worried a Russia, a China, a North Korea, if they had early warning capabilities, what do we think they're going to do between the time they detect a missile and the time it lands? You know, do they go, I don't know if it's conventional or nuclear, I don't know if it's lower yield or higher yield, and therefore I'm going to do what? Right. And so, and they may be just, I see anything coming at me, one missile, 100, whatever, however many. If I'm not sure, I'm going to just the Sunday punch that we had. Remember LeMay back in? We're just going to respond massively. Maybe that's what they think, but I think parsing what it is we're concerned they will do between the detection of the launch and the time it lands is something that we need to pull out. What is it?
I share many of your thoughts. For me, neither discrimination nor survivability are extreme acute worries, but they are factors, right? So, for example, I do not think that that a split launch would necessarily cause the destruction of an SSBN, but it does provide an adversary with additional information about the location of that boat, and so it allows them to narrow the search parameters. I don't think that Russia would necessarily launch a massive retaliation if it wasn't certain about the yield of a ballistic missile or a cruise missile. But it's a concern. We cannot know for sure. So all of this sort of factors into the question of whether they could be used, and that factors into the question of the credibility of that system in the first place. It's not an all or nothing issue. But more to the point, there's a question about discrimination, for example, with a SLCM. One of the reasons why we have moved a little bit away from dual capable systems is that not having that sea-launched cruise missile is great because it allows us to fire Tomahawks, right? Quickly, rapidly, easily. It allows us to do that, more readily without having to sort of make that pause to ask questions about discrimination. That's extremely permissive. That's helpful for defending against adversary aggression, in which we can, raise the intensity of those conflicts. So I think these aren't prohibitive concerns, but I think that they are factors. Yeah.
I think one thing that yes, we're going to come into it. What this puts on the table, I think, is an interesting question. It's possible to argue that all three of these issues, whether it's the discrimination or the others, are absolutely not problems, therefore we don't need to do anything about them. Mm-hmm. It's also possible to argue that they're insurmountable problems. In other words, there's no way to mitigate them. There also might be a view that says, well, okay, so there are factors. If I go from having, if I add additional questions about discrimination, aren't there other compensatory messages or measures or actions that might mitigate that risk, even if you don't fully agree on the extent of the risk? Do you see what I'm asking?
I think you're right. I think there are things that we could do, but I think there are 2 points to be made. The first point is discrimination by whom about what? I mean, it's been an argument for the past couple of years that a U.S. dual-capable cruise missile is destabilizing. Well, destabilizing to whom? The Russians are churning out ground-launched, air-launched, and sea-launched dual-capable systems like sausages. The Chinese are doing the same thing. I mean, destabilizing in whose eyes? Obviously not in the eyes of the Russian or Chinese military leadership. So who is it destabilizing to our own community? Okay. If that's the case you want to make, that's fine. But it's not destabilizing to the Russians and Chinese because of the road that they're going down. And again, I think the second point, and it's one I'm sorry that I just have to keep returning to, is the discussion kind of goes to the next phase. Okay, the U.S. has launched something. What will the Russians do? The point is, because we can do a wide variety of things, the Russian leadership has to be convinced they're not supposed to go nuclear in the first place. Look, this is what it's all about. It's about preventing a nuclear war. And more conventional forces are not going to prevent Russian first use. In fact, some people have made the argument that conventional superiority forces the Russians to use nuclear weapons first. So I mean, again, let's focus on what this is all about. This is not about the United States trying to fight a nuclear war. It's trying to prevent a nuclear war and a conventional war, which leads nicely to your next question.
It does. But one thing I think is really interesting about this discussion, and I just want to note, I've noticed it in the context of the debate as it's gone on and has played out, for example, in the 3 pieces in War on the Rocks. You know, I've jokingly said, well, we're having the nuclear Olympics right now. They come around once every 8 years. You know, one of the things is that we are forcing ourselves to put a lot more facts on the table. I mean, one of the things that we've started to realize in this dialogue, even on a few of these issues like the D5, is that there were some facts missing from the debate.
Absolutely.
Whether it's about the British Trident capabilities or existing policies that we've had for a long time and mistaken notions. So I do think there's something useful and important in forcing that debate out more publicly and getting that to go back and forth. So I think that's really useful. So one area that I want to make sure we talk about, because we're going to be coming out to questions in just a couple of minutes, is about declaratory policy. Because I think if there is one area where the argument between, you know, there's absolutely no change, no, there's tons of change, there absolutely is lots of change, no, there's no change, really seems to be there. About the nature of the declaratory policy. And I looked up a few things, and so here's the thing. I don't know if it's so much it's changed as that it got added to in a couple of specific ways. Because the key phrase, the United States wishes to stress it would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States and its allies or partners, that part is exactly the same. It is the going on to attempt to define extreme circumstances and what it could include, I think, that has gotten people pretty excited, which is interesting, right? Because the first version, which was in the Obama administration NPR, left it wide open. It was a little bit eye to the beholder. And in this one, tries to put more specificity, and here we kind of end up. So that's just my setup, and I think my question is, to what extent do you think it really, you know, not in the bomb throwing change same, do you think there was an intentional difference? Is there a new problem we need to solve? Is there not a problem that, you know, we need to solve? It's just clarification. What is there, and do you think across the board that there's room, kind of like my last point, is it really just that it's good the way it is or it's absolutely terrible, or are there ways to kind of amplify this discussion to provide some reassurance about what really is intended or not? Elaine, can I start with you?
Sure. I'm not sure that it objectively expands the set of scenarios where the U.S. might consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances or where there are catastrophic consequences, right? So in that way, that's that side of the argument. Right. On the other hand, it is a difference in declaratory policy. We've never elaborated in this way. So yes, it is a change in the public elaboration of this. So, so then the question is, so why talk about it? Why do this declaratory policy? Yeah. And I can only speculate. Because I wasn't part of this, but so it seems if you're worried about capabilities that others have, in this case, cyber or space capabilities, and if you don't have great responses or you don't have confidence in your responses, then you pull out the potential nuclear response flag. And so that's how I interpret it. Of course, that does advertise to your adversary that, you know, you think you are vulnerable there. On the other hand, it says, you may not think this is a big deal if you took out an early warning satellite, or if there were some really catastrophic, I don't mean hacking cell phones, really catastrophic cyber attack. You may not think this is a big deal because it wasn't nuclear. We do think it's a big deal, and we're concerned that you don't understand that we think it's a big deal, so we're going to tell you that we think it's a big deal. So that's kind of how I interpret it.
Yeah.
Not new and new.
Well, no, I think that's exactly right. I do think there's an important, in the what's added, the elaboration, there kind of, in my mind, there are two categories of things in there that perhaps would benefit from a little bit of parsing. There are some things that are clearly kind of outside of the nuclear domain. They're, whether it's civilian infrastructure or other, they've raised this question about this sort of cross-domain issue. Would you use a nuclear weapon to respond to a cyber attack type thing outside of a nuclear domain? Then there are others that I think are clearly about an attack that's intended to degrade our nuclear capability. Both are kind of in there, and actually, at least in my mind, those two things are actually somewhat different.
Yeah.
I would have thought it would be pretty clear, I would hope an adversary would think, that taking out our early warning is like, that's inside the nuclear box in my mind. So I think so this issue of parsing, I think, is kind of important in terms of what is part and parcel of what rather directly leads to a nuclear exchange or kind of engages that, and which things are somewhat more, for lack of a better phrase, I'm going to say, cross-domain.
So I would just emphasize, I agree with everything Elaine said. I think it's not only counterproductive, but also inaccurate to say that there is no change in U.S. declaratory policy. The reason why it's counterproductive is there are areas in deterrence theory where ambiguity is beneficial. There are areas in deterrence theory where ambiguity is absolutely disadvantageous, and clarity is what's required. I'm not certain that this is the right kind of ambiguity, right? The question of whether U.S. early warning satellites would elicit or would sort of put a nuclear attack on the table is very well taken. I think that it makes a relatively strong statement there. There's some stronger language with respect to organizations that support terrorist groups in a pursuit to achieve fissile material or a nuclear capability. That's stronger language than it has in the past, right? These aren't qualitative changes, but they are certainly changes, right? The question is about civilian infrastructure and cyber attacks. Here, there's been some contradictory language, and I don't think that that's helpful ambiguity, right? So Elaine says there should be no question in our adversary's mind that certain actions along these lines can create or put nuclear weapons onto the table. It's reasonable to have that kind of statement in there, but you want more clarity about precisely where this would occur. And so, I worry that there was probably some internal debate going on about how to define a non-nuclear strategic attack that's been amplified in subsequent statements trying to clarify this, right? Whether it's fundamentally untrue or whether in fact that was intended. I think that could have benefited by more clarity, more thought, and then an accurate representation of precisely what the NPR says, rather than trying to sort of smudge the boundaries.
So I think that's a perfect segue into what I was going to say, that what does the NPR say? I mean, the three of us have been in government. I mean, we know how language is parsed. The NPR is clear. After it repeats the statement from 2010, it then says extreme circumstances could include significant non-nuclear strategic attacks. It doesn't say it will. It doesn't say it does. It says could include. And then it says significant non-nuclear attacks include but are not limited to. And now we go to Elaine's point. Attacks on U.S. allied or partner civilian populations or infrastructure. Attacks on U.S. or allied nuclear forces, their command and control or warning and attack assessment capabilities. And I think what we've seen over the past 10 years is the proliferation of anti-space capabilities. We've seen prompt global strike and other kinds of long-range conventional capabilities, which if deployed in numbers create these kinds of threats. The NPR does not say, you will not find in the NPR, that we're going to use nuclear weapons to deter or respond to cyber attack. And it doesn't get much more authoritative than Paul Selby, who's the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who said publicly, the interpretation that a cyber attack would be met by a U.S. nuclear strike is not supported by the document. We never said cyber. Selva. So again, I mean, I fully understand the points being made, but let's be clear as to what this says. There have been, as Elaine pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, there have been a whole series of developments in terms of threats to nuclear forces, nuclear command and control, and you could use prompt global strike to take out a significant element of civilian infrastructure. So it is what it is, but it isn't what it isn't, right?
If only it were that clear, right? Because Vladimir Putin this morning, speaking to his parliament, his national address, said that that U.S. cyber attacks sort of put that issue on the table. So he received the wrong message. Would that he had read it as closely as
I
you
don't
had,
think
Frank.
he received the wrong message. This is the same guy who said there were no Russian troops in Crimea or Ukraine, and said it with a straight face. And the Russian Foreign Ministry came out Friday damning the NPR, saying that they were in full compliance with the Budapest Memorandum, which guarantees Ukraine's sovereignty, which is a bit of a surprise to the people in Crimea and the Donbass. So, you know, I think what I take from the Putin speech is, one, the nuclear posture review was actually received and read at the highest levels of the Russian government.
Sure.
That's not a bad idea.
No.
Two, it got them to decide to do some chest pounding and bigger buttons on nuclear capabilities. And you know, I love the new 50,000-mile cruise missile to defeat the vast air defenses that the United States doesn't have, for those in the audience who don't pay attention. So I think we're okay. I mean, I understand the need for clarity, but I also think that if they'd wanted to say this is going to be used against cyber attack, they would have said it.
So I'm going to offer one thought for both sides of this debate for people to consider, and open actually to questions. So we'll get some microphones ready. I think this issue of the declaratory policy is one that isn't going to fully go away, because I think declaratory policy really is a discussion. Mm-hmm. It's something that continues. And so I think on the one hand, with this review having opened the door on these clarifying statements, this increasing, reducing an element of ambiguity and so forth, I suspect it's going to invite the need for some assurance and further explanation in ways that might be different from the past, where I said my policy and it's done. I do also think on the other side of that debate, though, it is important to read always something like a declaratory policy in toto. And that includes, for example, emphasizing equally the negative security assurance that's present also in the declaratory policy, because that very much narrows the bounds of where even these attacks are being and responses are being considered, and I think that sometimes vacates the debate. But with that,
could I make one
comment? Yes,
just because
we'll start moving the microphones.
There's all
up
this
as
talk
one here.
about continuity and/or change, and I know I've been attacked by saying it's squarely in the mainstream. I think let's define what mainstream is. Mainstream is we use nuclear weapons to deter major conventional attack and nuclear attack on the United States and our allies. We do that with flexible capabilities. Kennedy administration, Nixon, Ford, Kennedy Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Schlesinger, all the way up. The fundamental tenets that we will have flexible options and flexible capabilities to deter major attack, nuclear and non-nuclear, on ourselves and our allies, is the core, and it was the core all the way back. There are going to be differences in some elements of declaratory policy. No one's saying there isn't. But as far as a fundamental policy within the United States of America, this thing has roots that go back a long time.
All right. So as you frame your questions, please make sure they're a question, that they're brief, and please introduce yourself and your affiliation. So, sir, if you'd go first.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I'd like to address this to Adam. I'm going to, if we totally simplify and say there's two options, the one that you were talking about, we've got very good deterrence, people understand, or B, we're going to add redundancies to our deterrence, and maybe that sends a message, and low yield here and there, in addition to what we have already, which presumably is enough. So A or B. The question is, What message does this NPR, or the choice between those two, send to other countries? We've got a lot of people developing nuclear weapons, thinking about nuclear weapons. What if you were imagined in North Korea and they read this? Does that make them more determined to not give up their nuclear weapons or missiles? Does that make them more determined to add even further capabilities to their deterrent system? Or, I hate to say Japan, but if Japan, as sometimes suggested, if they lost faith in the U.S. and they decided to go to nuclear, does that mean that they're going to have all sorts of low-yield weapons right and left? And then what does that do in terms of overall stability in the world? And I could throw in Pakistan, too.
All right, well, that's a lot. One thing I think I will do, just so we can also get a kind of a diversity of inputs, is why don't I take a second one and we'll kind of divvy them up in the panel. So, Meyer, I think you've got one here.
Thank you. Sarah McCunniff from the MITRE Corporation. We've talked a lot today about the weapon systems, but one thing we haven't discussed is something that's addressed in the NPR, and that's NC3, Nuclear Command, Control, and Communications. I'd be interested in your observations on that.
Okay. So Adam, maybe you can kind of roll up on the first question, and then we'll also touch on NC3. You're right, that's a different thing we haven't covered.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great question. I'm not certain that the nuclear posture review speaks directly to North Korea. I'm not sure how much it pertains, that the asymmetry is just too vast. Actually, I think a lot of the language about deterring North Korea is very well taken. It sometimes feels out of step with certain statements from the White House, but in that regard, I think it's highly beneficial. My concern is that nuclear deterrence is about perceptions. It's like the stock market. If you think something's going to fall, it ends up falling. If you say there's a gap when there wasn't one, you create a gap, because the adversary then thinks that you lack resolve or confidence in your response options. So part of my concern is that for adversaries, the NPR evinces a concern about technological developments and seems to suggest that it undermines our confidence in our deterrent, right? And so I don't think we should be skittish about our deterrent. I think we have those options, and I think we should be confident in them. With respect to allies, there's this additional concern. There's a statement that's my particular, I dislike it the most in all the NPR, that says conventional weapons alone do not have comparable deterrent effects to nuclear ones. And that conventional weapons are not sufficient to assure some allies. For me, that's incredibly damaging, because our men and women work along the 38th parallel every day with our ROC allies. We work with the Japanese, with Southeast Asian allies. Not all of these are nuclear alliances, but some of them are. I worry that it says to our allies, don't think of this conventional interoperation as assurance, right? Wait for us to send a nuclear signal. When in fact what we should be saying is that the ability to defend against aggression, not just respond to it or retaliate to it, the ability to defend against aggression, to protect your civilians and your way of life, is the essence of assurance, right? Assurance comes from deterrence. It doesn't come from sort of necessarily a nuclear signal.
As one who,
yes, please,
for 4 years, co-chaired the extended deterrence dialogue with the Japanese, could I say that's exactly what we said? That deterrence is not just nuclear.
Great.
It is there's an extended nuclear deterrence.
Right.
That's what we bring to you, and so that you don't feel you need your own. However, everything there's what you do, whether it's sending up airplanes to patrol your own airspace in the East China Sea. That they do that. Or it's what we do together. And this can apply to the South Koreans too. Same discussions, yes. Goes on there. Yes. It's all of that is deterrence. The idea, though, that nuclear deterrence specifically doesn't play a big role against nuclear armed adversaries, I don't think you're saying that, are you?
No.
Okay. I just wanted to be sure that wasn't.
So I think that I'm just thinking that if these two modifications suggest a crisis of confidence on our end, I'm trying to imagine the size of the crisis of confidence that's occurring on the Russian side with everything.
Wait a minute, wait. Again, the third alternative to Adam's formula is that there's a gap that we've recognized, and it's dangerous for us to ignore the fact that the Russians have a doctrine that features tactical use to win on the battlefield, have the weapons to do it, and have exercised it. So that's the third option, and that's where we disagree.
Frank, can I ask you, the NPR says that it's a mistaken perception, that Russia has a mistaken perception that there's a gap in U.S. capabilities.
No, the NPR says that it would be mistaken for the Russians to believe that they can escalate and win on the battlefield. That they seem to have done that in the belief that there is a gap in our capability, and we're going to address that gap. And we make clear that it's the Russian military that's got this idea, and that we're trying to convince the political leadership that has control of a button not to go to aggression in the first place. I think there are two other points. The gentleman's point, there is this lovely misconception that if we lead, others will follow. Okay, so we demerged ICBMs and the Russians didn't. We got rid of TAC nukes basically and the Russians didn't. We did the Prague initiatives and the Russians didn't. Nuclear weapons programs in Russia, China, North Korea, and elsewhere have dynamics all their own. These are not stupid people. They're doing what they're doing because they believe what they need to do to defend themselves. And so the notion that if we do something, everybody's going to follow, I mean, it's a lovely theory, but it hasn't played out for us. To your question, ma'am.
Thank you. No, I was just, I'm just trying to referee here.
That is exactly why. First of all, nuclear command and control has been neglected far too long. This NPR document calls out nuclear command and control. General Hyten said the other day that nuclear command and control is the most important element of the modernization program. And you'll see not only comments in here about the nuclear command and control system, but also that General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has been tasked by May to produce a governance document, which means that Secretary Mattis is serious about finding one person around whose neck he can place his hands if the nuclear command and control system is not up to his requirements. So thanks for bringing it up. That is absolutely and totally crucial. Yes, the U.S. Well, I mean, I can't speak for the government, right? But it wouldn't be here if this wasn't a subject of concern and therefore of investment.
I will agree that it's an important area for investment. I will also point out that every nuclear posture review has talked about the importance of nuclear command and control. 94, 2001, 2010, every one of them has.
Right. For this one, I think it's here because people are determined to do something about it, because it has deteriorated.
That's good, because it is one of these core modernization priorities, right? Our labs and our military should get every dollar they need to make sure the weapons are safe, secure, and effective. And if pursuing a supplement could at all endanger that funding, I think that's a real concern.
But I have a feeling pretty much, I think everyone up here would agree that command and control has not received sufficient attention in the past, that we would probably welcome the attention that's in this NPR, and we remain eager to see it be actually implemented and followed through. Would anyone up here disagree with that? No, I didn't think so. Okay, next question. All right, I've got Ankit and John, if we could just sort of take these two, and then there's, and then back in the far side, we'll go over there. Okay.
Hi, thank you for that stimulating discussion. My question's for Frank Miller. You mentioned something quite interesting.
Remember to say who you are.
Oh, Ankit Panda. I'm senior editor at The Diplomat. The question is regarding a scenario you mentioned for the SLICM. You mentioned that outside of being a bargaining chip, it could potentially play a role in theater deterrence in East Asia, the Indo-Pacific region against China. Could you talk a bit more about that theory? How would that work in practice? Would the United States effectively escalate to get China to de-escalate? Is this a response system? I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
No, well, yes and no. I mean, I'm not going to create a deterrent scenario 15, 20 years hence. I mean, that's silly. I mean, we've been through this. There's going to be an AOA. They're going to come out with some reasons. They're going to talk about how they're going to deploy the system. If you look at China, you look at the most dynamic missile modernization program in the world right now. You look at militarized islands, which were pledged to not be militarized. You look at the continued statements about turning the South China Sea into an inland waterway. You look at Chinese threats to various neighbors and their territory. So this is a situation which has obviously concerns for us. And China, in its ballistic and cruise capabilities, has nuclear weapons, both ballistic and cruise. I don't know how that's going to turn out. I know that Admiral Harris, who's Commander-in-Chief Pacific, has, oh, I shouldn't say that, combatant, yeah, it's not saying, yeah, okay, I'm old. I'm old, he's PACOM, okay. That there are concerns about deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region 10, 15 years hence. So all I can tell you is, what's the situation now? I don't have any predictions as to how it will develop and how a TLAM will or will not play in that. But I think it's an open question.
Hi, John Wharton, SAIC. I think this question probably goes to Frank, but I'd be interested in everyone's answer.
Share alike.
So I think so. If you take it as a given, the Russia strategy of using nuclear weapons, kind of escalate, de-escalate, escalate to win, that they have some theory of potentially using nuclear weapons if they are losing or not doing well in a conventional conflict. And I think you implied, or at least said explicitly, that theory surrounds them potentially using them on the battlefield. So if the scenario is there's a fight in the Baltics, the U.S. is bringing...
How did that start in
whatever.
the Baltics? No. Did the Baltics invade the Russians?
The Russians invaded the Baltics.
Thank you.
The Russians have invaded the Baltics. The U.S. and NATO are coming to the defense of the Baltics. Russia uses nuclear weapons against those incoming troops to have an important impact on the balance, the military balance. Where does the low-yield D5 come in? If it's not going to be on the battlefield, as you said, how is it going to change the parameters of what happens there? And why is it that the focus is on yield? Like, why do we think that the threshold that they're worried about us not responding in is yield? Couldn't it be that they think that there's a distinction between theater and strategic, or using nuclear weapons on certain targets or with less collateral damage? Why is it that yield is the key focus, and why is the D5 going to fill that gap?
Want to share with this one before I take it?
I'd be delighted.
Please.
So I absolutely want to hear Frank's answer about what are the targets that are relevant or pertain, excuse me, I can't remember the exact language, but of interest to the Russian leadership that require a low-yield detonation to hold at risk promptly. Okay, let's stew on that. I don't want to take it as a given that Russia has an escalate to de-escalate strategy. That term has become almost axiomatic in Washington discussion. It has captured so much of the debate. What does it mean? This term is meant to cover a whole range of contingencies, from covering failed conventional aggression, successful conventional aggression, defense of Russian territory. These are all dramatically different scenarios. And so the fact that Russia could use nuclear weapons first is a concern. The fact that they could use it earlier in a conflict is a concern. We reserve those rights to ourselves. But we need to be more specific about what they hope to achieve and what are these discussions that are going on. Because if it's about covering successful conventional aggression, then the Russians will have invaded the Baltics. And we need to think seriously about why the Russians would want to invade the Baltics. Is it, what are they hoping to achieve? And then the question of retaliation, right? If the Russians have employed a low-yield nuclear weapon, they're essentially trying to shift the game from a conventional fight. They're hoping that we don't press the conventional fight and finish the job. And so if they can have confidence that they can elicit a nuclear response from us in return, that may be baked in. That might be what they have in mind. It might be, under those circumstances, and with other adversaries, that the best thing we can do is to ensure that we have credible conventional responses and that we have the resolve to continue to prosecute the fight.
But Adam, I want to get to what I really do think is John's question. I think this issue
of...
But
Frank asked me to...
well, no, that wasn't what he meant to do.
Oh. Then we need clarity and declaratory.
No, I think because I think there's something important in John's question.
Absolutely.
He's asking this discussion. He's saying this discussion has largely taken place around the question of yield, and then there's been an issue of targeting. So the issue is, why is the credibility gap? Is it really associated with yield? Is yield the critical aspect of a credibility gap? Or is it something else, like where it comes from, or the platform, or the promptness, or something like that? And to what extent is the credibility gap one that has to do with targeting? In other words, believing that we will choose a strategic. So it seems to be there's something about convincing them that we will manage escalation on the magnitude of the attack, but also escalate by going to a more strategic target as opposed to a battlefield target. Have I gotten to kind of the point of it? So I think that's a good question.
Okay. So I mean, everybody loves to play the game as if let's fight the nuclear war, right? So that's not a game that you can play credibly. I do, you do, I do back, right? Okay. So anybody can play that game. We've all fought the same number of nuclear wars, right? We've all got the same credentials. So let's go back to the beginning. You want to deter aggression in any way. The notion, I will say it's a null set that NATO is going to attack the Russian territory, okay? That's my null set. Say again?
I was not implying that was...
Okay. To Adam's point, if the Russians have used a nuclear weapon and we keep putting more conventional troops in, I don't know how the NATO allies are going to react. And it just calls for the Russians to use nuclear weapons a second time. So you need to have a stout conventional defense, but I don't think that is sufficient. The third point is, again, I mean, I'm sorry to keep repeating this. It is certainly the view of the U.S. government and our NATO allies that the Russians have three things. They have written about the need to use nuclear weapons to halt a conventional war. They kept older tactical battlefield weapons, and they have bought new ones, and they've exercised the whole thing. It's somewhat ironic that people say, well, don't we want to respond on the battlefield? Absolutely not. We are not interested in fighting a battlefield nuclear war. We're not interested in fighting a nuclear war, period. Responding in kind in the battlefield, I think you're right. The Russians have probably taken that on board and have said, that's okay. You know, we can accept another portion of the Baltics being destroyed. That's not acceptable. So we're back to deterrence. And what is deterrence about? Deterrence says, if you do something, the cost that will be imposed upon you will be greater than the gains you hope to make. That's classic, basic deterrence theory, right? And so the choice of a D5 with the capability to reach deep into Russia, any place, says we have the capability to escalate. Not because we want to escalate, but because we are warning you, do not take the first step. The choice of targets at this point in this discussion is immaterial. It is the view of the NPR, therefore of the DoD, therefore of the U.S. government, which is not infallible, but it is the view that in looking at what the Russians say, buy, and practice, and what we have, the only thing that we don't have right now is a prompt, low-yield weapon, which we propose to buy in very, very small numbers. And because it's different than anything that's come along in the past, this has become the focus of the debate on the NPR. Okay, I get it. And the Slickum. Okay.
I can hardly get you guys going on this Slickum. All right, so what I'd like to do, because we're coming close to the end of our time, I want to make sure that we get a break. Am I right, Will? I'm running out? Yes. So, but I do want to take the last question over here. Actually,
not me.
No, go ahead.
Are you sure? Yeah. There were two hands close together. Okay.
Okay, I can be really quick.
One's deferred. All right, thank you.
I can be really quick. I have a brief comment and a really concise question.
Okay.
My brief comment is for the historian in me. Elaine mentioned how interesting the idea of using the Slickum in an arms control environment as leverage against the Russians. And the NPR mentions that, and Secretary Mattis mentioned that, and there seems to be this sense going around that we have to do something in the cruise missile area to bring the Russians to the table. Just for the sake of history, I'd like to remind people when we deployed Pershing IIs and Glickums in Europe in 1983, the Soviets left the negotiating table. It wasn't until political change happened a few years later that they came back. So if you want to use the model, you got to bring in the political change too. My question is concise. Can anybody give me a number on the yield of the low-yield weapon?
Yes and no. Yeah. And to your point, Amy, it's not correct. The Russians the Soviets were conducting a massive...
Oh, I know.
No, my turn. A massive Psy-war campaign to undermine NATO solidarity, okay? They thought that they could stop the initial deployments of the INF systems. When it became apparent, and the walkout was part of that, Elaine lived this, I lived at one office down. When it became apparent, they could not stop that. And when the political leadership understood that these weapons were real and in Europe and were capable of hitting targets in Russia, they returned to the negotiating table. And you would not have received the INF Treaty without those deployments.
I fully agree.
Now, with respect to SLCM, we've all talked about whether or not it's going to be a good bargaining chip or not. The other alternative would be to put stuff on the ground in Europe, which I absolutely do not support. So, if there's a bargaining chip, it may be a weak one, or if it is what it is. But don't distort the history on this one.
Can I get a yield?
Elaine, do you have
Can I get a yield?
You've studied this for a long time. What's your take?
On SLCM as a bargaining chip or some other issue that we on the...
No. Well, I think specifically, I think this issue of the relationship, I'm going to put it this way. The relationship of the SLCM to the INF Treaty in terms of helping us do what I think everyone would agree we want to do,
is have them come back into compliance.
Get them back into compliance.
Yeah.
How useful or not is that? Question one. And how relevant even are the historical analogies at this point? Are they helpful? Are we learning the right lessons, do you think? Or are we, run the risk of learning the wrong lessons because the environment's changed so much? What do you think?
Well, when I said earlier that in my experience in arms control, the Russians don't give up something for nothing, that wasn't just based on INF. Amy's nodding her head, I think she agrees with that. And I would agree with Frank that it's not feasible to have ground-based missiles in Europe and do tit for tat. And it was clear that's just not going to happen. But if you care about arms control and you want to have it in the future, treaties have to matter. And whether it brings them back and makes them get rid of the SSC-8, or it just says there will be consequences explicitly because of what you did in your violation. If you are consistent in saying the SLCM we deployed it because of your violation, if that's a consistent message, well, at least there has been, there was some cost to them of violating the treaty. But that's from will it work in getting them to get rid of the SSC-8? I don't know. I don't know that anybody does. And that's, I'm happy for this discussion in that it's been a little more nuanced than some of these discussions. It's why I don't like bumper stickers. I don't like to escalate to de-escalate either. Bumper stickers don't clarify issues, I don't think. So I'm delighted that we've had a more textured discussion today on these. Textured. I mean, if we're going to talk, how many of you sew? Okay, have you ever made, we can talk tailored if you want to, but no, I don't know if it will bring them back into compliance. I think doing nothing certainly won't, and it's not good for arms control prospects for the future.
Well, I think this is thank you, Elaine, I think you've kind of actually hit on exactly what I wanted to say as I bring this session to a close, as we have accomplished a couple of things that are very important for us here at PONI. We have delivered to you a truly wonky discussion about the nuclear posture review and the theoretical questions, and actually one of our goals was to try to dig in and get into some of the details. So I'm willing to bet that half of you were completely engrossed and the other half of you were like, oh my gosh. So
it could have gotten wonkier. It could have been.
It could. There's always a new level of wonky that we can get to, but I think we've achieved in this discussion, and I really want to thank you all for doing that. And the second thing is that it's our goal in PONI to represent a range of views and have that respectful debate about what is it, and recognize that we may not walk away from the dais agreeing, but we will walk away having heard the other person. And that is at least my goal when we do this. So with that, if I could ask you to join me in thanking our panelists today. We have, I believe, a quick break, and then we will come back in for our next panel. So thank you very much. We'll get started with our second panel. All right. Well, once again, thank you very much to all of you for being here today. Just in case you are just joining us, I am Rebecca Hersman. I'm the director of the Project on Nuclear Issues here at CSIS, and we're very pleased to welcome you to this conference on the Nuclear Posture Review and assessing its policy impacts and implications. We had a great keynote discussion from Undersecretary Rood, sort of laying out much of the administration's case. We just had a discussion about declaratory policy and some of the new capabilities and kind of talking about pros and cons and issues on the table. And I think we have covered a lot of the deterrence theory pretty thoroughly. I'm not sure we came to conclusions, but I think we've covered a lot of the theoretical points. So now we're going to move to a discussion of, well, then what are the implications of the NPR for the regions where we're most concerned, and what are the reactions in those regions to the NPR? So that is what we're going to be talking about for the next bit of time. As we do that, I just want to remind you that this session is being live streamed, and it is on the record. You, as I've said before, will have the chance to watch it twice if you so desire. You can always go back and review. So with that, let me just go ahead and introduce the speakers who are joining us for today's panel. First, I would like to introduce Frank Rose, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and newly similarly at the Brookings Institution.
On Monday.
On Monday, okay. So that is indeed new, but congratulations on that. Frank served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control Verification and Compliance from 2014 to 2017. Prior to that, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Space and Defense Policy, and he's held a number of positions in the House of Representatives and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He has had a long career. To my far right, we welcome back Dr. Corey Shockey, Deputy Director General at the IISS. So this is our first chance to welcome you in your new capacity as well, so congratulations to you. Corey has held a number of policy positions across government, academia, think tanks. She's worked with the military and civilian staffs of the Pentagon, at the White House, the National Security Council, and at the State Department. She's authored a number of books, most notably her recent one called Safe Passage, which has received a great amount of attention. They will be discussing the European side of the equation today. To my left, I have our Asia and Korea team, who will be looking at it from that perspective. To my far left, we have Dr. Sumi Terry, who is a senior fellow here as part of the Korea chair here at CSIS. Before coming to CSIS, she served as a senior analyst on Korean issues at the CIA. She served as the director for Korea, Japan, and Oceanic Affairs at the National Security Council under both Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And she served as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for East Asia at the National Intelligence Council. And finally, we have Ankit Panda, who's a senior editor at The Diplomat. Ankit is an award-winning writer, analyst, and researcher. He focuses on international security, geopolitics, and economics. His work has appeared in a range of publications around the world, and he's a frequent participant in a range of Track 2 dialogues involving Asia, Europe, and North America. So we have a terrific amount of expertise up here. I've asked them to first speak to Europe, and then secondly to the North Korea-Asia perspective. They'll talk each for about 5 minutes and kind of offer some of their thoughts to get it started in terms of implications for the region, reactions within the region. I'll ask them a few questions, and then we'll obviously open up to all of you. So with that, I believe, Frank, you drew the card to go first.
Great. Oh, Rebecca, thanks so much for having me here today. In my brief remarks, I want to do 3 things. First, provide you my assessment of Allied reaction. Major challenge moving forward. Truth in advertising, I can sometimes be critical of the current administration. However, in the context of the Nuclear Posture Review, I think the administration has done a good job engaging our allies and partners. And from what I understand, the 2018 NPR established a good consultation mechanism to enable allies to input into the reviews. And furthermore, from what I have seen and heard, allies are generally happy with the review. Though this is in the Asia-Pacific region, the Japanese foreign minister said, quote, Japan highly appreciates the latest NPR, which clearly articulates U.S. resolve to ensure the effectiveness of its deterrent commitments. There really hasn't been too many public statements by senior officials in Europe on the NPR one way or the other. The only thing that I have been able to find is a negative comment from the German foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel. However, I'm not sure if those comments fully reflect the German government's view, particularly the Chancellor's office and the Ministry of Defense. I think when you actually read the NPR, it has very good language on extended deterrence, outlining the importance of extended deterrence. And secondly, it recommends a number of specific actions to enhance extended deterrence. For example, moving forward with the B-21 bomber and the long-range standoff cruise missile, introducing a new sea-launched cruise missile, enhancing the readiness and survivability of NATO's dual-capable aircraft, and continuing to work with the allies on consultative mechanisms. Now, overall, I think the NPR is good for extended deterrence broadly, but also in Europe. The Russian reaction. Well, the Russian reaction was predictable. The rhetoric coming out of the Russian Foreign Ministry is just priceless. A couple of my favorite quotes include the content of the new nuclear doctrine, the so-called Nuclear Posture Review, released by the United States on February 2nd, has provoked deep disappointment. The confrontational and anti-Russian nature of this document strikes the eye. But what the Russian Foreign Ministry statement fails to mention is that Russia, through its violation of the INF Treaty, illegal occupation of Crimea, continued efforts to destabilize Ukraine, and meddling in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, has really set the stage for the deterioration of the security environment. That said, I think it's very important to continue to engage Russia in a dialogue, but the purpose of that dialogue should not be to negotiate a new arms reductions agreement, which is totally unrealistic given the current circumstances. Instead, that dialogue should be focused on the twin goals of reducing risk and sending very clear deterrent messages to Russia. So let me conclude, though, with what I think is the big challenge with regards to the NPR and extended deterrence. Well, I think Trump administration senior officials that I've heard speak on the issue have been very measured and thoughtful in their public statements. I think there is concern with some of the statements coming out of the White House. I'm not going to cite the list, I think we all know, but make no mistake. These statements are having an impact, especially amongst European publics. And as someone who was responsible for managing the nuclear relationships with a number of allies, I can tell you, in several allies like Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, and Japan, there is a very, very strong anti-nuclear feeling. And our ally governments have to work very, very closely to manage that those public relations, especially when it comes to issues like funding new dual-capable aircraft in support of NATO's nuclear mission. Furthermore, a lot of these nations are facing a lot of pressure from their publics on things like the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. And I assure you, the Russians will do whatever they can to fan dissent within allied countries to make it more difficult. So it's really important that we are mindful of this and help our allied governments manage it. But I want to make one last point, and this is something that people forget, and that is this. The United States cannot effectively deter or defend itself against strategic threats from countries like North Korea, China, and Russia without the support of our allies. And this is a real military reason. I remind people in the room, the United Kingdom and Denmark host very important early warning radars that provide warning of strategic attack against the United States. Those two radars are also vital to the missile defense of the United States, not the Allies, missile defense of the United States. The Japanese government hosts 2 missile defense radars in Japan that support both regional missile defense, but U.S. homeland missile defense. And finally, there are relay ground stations around the world that provide important warning information to the United States to protect the United States against strategic threats. So therefore, it's critical that we keep our allies on board with our nuclear policies. Now, let me just conclude by saying, while the NPR is very good on extended deterrence, it says the right things, and it actually does the right things. I think the long-term challenge is going to be balancing what the NPR says with some of the rhetoric that we've heard. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Corey, what are you saying from your perspective?
So I think this is a nuclear posture review that allies can like, that makes it easy for allies to get behind, and was crafted explicitly in that way. And I think that's extraordinarily helpful, especially in a European context. First, the threat. Europeans have been anxious that the Trump administration isn't taking the Russian threat seriously enough, that we didn't react as strongly as they might have liked. Chairman Thornberry, I see, has excelled at emphasizing just how dangerous the Russians are in their meddling in our domestic debates and in the invasion of Crimea. The charge sheet against the Russians is long and is comprehensive, and we are reacting to, as the NPR points out, a dramatically deteriorating security environment that the Russians caused in Europe. And so by placing responsibility squarely on the Russians, European allies are reassured by that. This is actually comfortable and they're happy about it, and that it's that clear about cause and effect does help make the public case for this. That said, I don't think very many European defense ministries, and certainly not very many European chancelleries, want to have a big public conversation about nuclear deterrence. I think the hesitance with which Europeans have approached Russia's violations of the INF Treaty suggests that they're not confident they have enough public support to really lean forward and talk about what is existing NATO strategy, repeated in the Nuclear Posture Review, that ultimately our defense relies on nuclear deterrence. And that means ultimately our defense relies on maintaining and threatening to use nuclear weapons in defense of our territory, our people, and our allies. The second thing I noticed about the Nuclear Posture Review is I actually, Ankit, we were talking earlier about how nerdy the previous panel was. I actually tallied the number of times allies or allied obligations are mentioned in this Nuclear Posture Review, 127. 5 in the Secretary's first 2-page Welcome to the Nuclear Posture Review statement. They are clearly trying to reassure allies that we are not unilaterally, we are not innocent of their concerns, we are not moving in a direction that we're not going to be able to move together in. And I think that, from an allied perspective, is the most important thing that comes out of the Nuclear Posture Review. And a second element of allied reassurance that came through really strongly on the European count was the extent to which they had thought through the SLBM and SLC, the low yield options, in a way that wasn't going to raise the question of stationing for allies. They did it on purpose. Europeans are really grateful they did it on purpose. I myself have always wondered whether if an SPD chancellor of Germany hadn't endorsed the Glickam, the 1980s INF deployments, if even a conservative German Chancellor Kohl would have gone through with it. Nobody wants to have that conversation now, especially not when what they want is a tighter binding of us and the allies. They don't want to have a big public conversation that's going to bring that unglued. The third thing I notice about it is how contingent the low yield options are. They're very clearly designed to incentivize the Russians back into compliance with the INF Treaty and the other treaties that they are in violation of. I thought that was quite a smart grace note. I'm a lot less concerned than Adam about what specific targets are we talking about in what stage of battle, because I thought the point made on the earlier panel that this only comes into effect if the Russians have started a war by invading NATO allies. It's about war prevention, and I think that comes through really, really clearly, and that we are incentivizing Russia's return. European allies are fine with that. I don't think the German chancellor would have much difficulty supporting anything in the nuclear posture review.
All right, thank you. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, let's look to a different region. I think Europe definitely, and Russia certainly figured prominently, noticeably, and very upfront in the nuclear posture review and driving a lot of the decisions that were made there. But North Korea would definitely seem to be the crisis du jour in a more urgent / imminent sense. So, Ankit, what's your take? Where do we stand? And then we'll go to Sue.
Sure, thank you. So I'll talk a bit about some of the things we witnessed in the lead up to the NPR, and then what the NPR says and does about those developments with regard to the Korean Peninsula. So something happened last year that strategic thinkers, nuclear strategists in the United States haven't really had to think about since at least 1971, about 46 years. 1971 was the year that China first tested its DF-5 intercontinental range ballistic missile. That gave China the capability to deliver a thermonuclear payload to the entire continental United States. And China became the second adversary that the United States had that capability. Last year in 2017, a third adversary acquired that capability. North Korea tested the Hwasong-15 on November 29th, and that missile unambiguously allows it to range the entire United States, including the entire peninsula of Florida. It tested a high-yield nuclear device, what the U.S. intelligence community called an advanced nuclear device. Boosted fission, two-stage thermonuclear, we don't know. Doesn't really matter at the end of the day. What matters is that it could probably deliver a 250 kiloton warhead to any American city. The North Koreans have made quite a few strides last year. I'll go through their nuclear forces really quickly. I find it helps to think about North Korea's nuclear forces in terms of 3 target sets. So the first target set that I talked about has always been aspirational for them, which is the U.S. homeland. Last year, they demonstrated that they had at least 2 systems capable of ranging parts and 1 capable of ranging all of the U.S. homeland. The Hwasong-14 was the first system. They first tested that on July 4th, which incidentally was the same day that they broke their missile testing moratorium in 2006. And then they tested the Hwasong-15. So both of those missiles do have a capability to range the U.S. homeland. We have not seen them tested yet to a so-called minimum energy trajectory, which shows that they're essentially ready for credible use against targets. There are some technical limitations as to why they might not want to do that, and also some diplomatic ones. So taking a step back now from that target set of U.S. homeland cities, the next target set that really matters for North Korea is Guam. That's right, the tiny U.S. territory of Guam holds an outsized importance in North Korea's targeting and thinking about how they need to deter what they see as persistent attempts by the United States to coerce them through nuclear means. So Guam, obviously we have Andersen Air Force Base, the forward presence for Pacific Command's bomber presence. North Korea has credibly, I think, demonstrated that they are capable of delivering a payload to Guam. Their September 14th, 2017 ballistic missile test of the Hwasong-12, which is an intermediate range ballistic missile based off that same engine set that we saw in the ICBMs, single-stage missile, liquid-fueled. They demonstrated that they could fly that to a range further than Guam. When they flew it over Japan, the re-entry vehicle did not successfully make it down, as far as I understand. There was a bit of tumbling. It probably survived to about 1 kilometer. But for all intents and purposes, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the commander of Strategic Command have said that they're operating as if North Korea now has the capability to target U.S. territory. If not Guam, then perhaps the U.S. homeland as well. And finally, the third target set on the Korean Peninsula is where North Korea has, in some way or another, been able to deter the U.S.-South Korea alliance conventionally for a while, possibly also with biological and chemical weapons, but now with nuclear weapons as well. We probably are dealing with now a North Korea that has standardized at least 2 warhead designs. One of those is a simple fission device, probably 30 to 40 kilotons. That's the device that they tested at their 5th test. It's supposedly standardized for deployment with most of their short-range, medium-range, and intermediate-range systems. And then we have the larger thermonuclear warhead, which is intended for delivery to the U.S. homeland. On the Korean Peninsula, however, there were a few developments that went fairly unnoticed last year because of the ICBMs, which understandably grabbed most of the headlines. So North Korea has been converting a lot of its older Scuds that they've essentially had in their inventory since the early 80s, late 1970s. They've been iterating on those, exploring the use of maneuverable re-entry vehicles that might allow them to use their short-range missiles with a nuclear configuration for soft counterforce use on the Korean Peninsula to make warfighting for the United States and South Korea mighty difficult. And I think we've seen that reflected in the alliance, because last year the Ulchi Freedom Guardian exercise for the first time simulated warfighting in a nuclearized environment. Now, very briefly, before I get to the NPR, I do want to talk about what North Korea's strategy is with all of these systems. So North Korea has an explicit first-use strategy to deter the United States from beginning an invasion or a decapitation attack against Kim Jong-un. The first strike approach is backed up with the ICBMs. If the United States were to ever attack North Korea, after North Korea had first initiated an attack, they say that if they detect any attempt at preemption, if they detect the U.S. moving assets, withdrawing dependence from the Korean Peninsula, that they would potentially take that as a sign of an impending invasion, use nuclear weapons, and then to deter the United States from sustaining an invasion, they would use the ICBMs to hold the U.S. homeland at risk. And that also introduces the threat of decoupling, which I think I'll leave for Sue to talk about a little bit. So that's their strategy, shortly put. And I do want to say a bit about command and control in North Korea. As far as we understand, it's highly monolithic, highly assertive. We don't know much about positive or negative controls for North Korean nuclear weapons. In a crisis, there are incentives for North Korea that would ensure that they devolve or pre-delegate use authority to units in the field, which makes the possibility of nuclear use on the Korean Peninsula unpleasantly high. Now, the Nuclear Posture Review takes note of this. I do want to say a bit about China, but the Nuclear Posture Review mentions North Korea 49 times, mentions China 47 times. I think there is a clear recognition that this new threat that emerged last year, the third adversary capable of delivering a thermonuclear weapon to the U.S. homeland, is reflected in the Nuclear Posture Review. I think it's positive that the Nuclear Posture Review affirms a longstanding U.S. commitment to use nuclear weapons first to defend its allies on the peninsula. That has been a bedrock of U.S. deterrence towards North Korea, and the North Koreans recognize that. And I think they've built their strategic thinking and their capabilities in recognition of that. Very quickly on China, I do want to mention this because we were talking about Asia. So I think it's interesting that the Nuclear Posture Review introduces this lingering suspicion that, again, isn't new in the United States, that effectively China's longstanding policy of no first use is something of a canard, cannot be relied on. China's had this in place since 1964. Authoritative Chinese writings, People's Liberation Army Rocket Force writings, and before that, Second Artillery Corps have consistently emphasized no first use. In 2013, China released a national defense strategy that didn't mention no first use, and people had a little bit of a conniption about that, and then they later reintroduced it in 2015, and we've seen more recent statements. But there is this lingering suspicion that China's breakneck development of theater ballistic missile systems, including the DF-17, the first deployable hypersonic glide vehicle payload on a ballistic missile, uses a modified DF-16 booster. The intelligence community assesses that it will probably see deployment by 2020. So in combination, I think this idea that China might use nuclear weapons first does not appear to be supported. Again, I think it's sort of similar to some of the discussions we've heard about escalate to de-escalate. Again, this might change. I think what we see with Chinese capabilities, especially Chinese command and control, I think makes their no first use posture quite credible. Warheads and delivery systems, as far as we know, remain demated in China. The warhead units cannot talk to the ballistic missile units, so the only way to put them together is if the chairman of the Central Military Commission, Xi Jinping, gives the order. Of course, Xi Jinping appears to be on a trajectory to be declared emperor for life right now, so who knows what's possible with Chinese nuclear posture in the coming days. But I think that aspect of the nuclear posture review I found interesting. And then finally, one more note, I'll just say I think China is going to be reading the U.S. Missile Defense Review with a lot more interest than it has read the nuclear posture review. I think missile defense is what keeps Chinese strategic thinkers up at night. The Chinese have an assured retaliation posture. They sleep well at night when they know that their warheads can get through to the U.S. homeland, and missile defenses worry them. They don't believe that our missile defenses are limited. We don't believe that their no first use posture is a no first use posture. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Sue, over to you, and I think that help us understand what's happening in the region, and especially in terms of our ROC allies. How are they seeing things? Yeah.
Well, okay, sure. I'll talk about the South Korea piece a little later. You did amazing job just laying out the nuclear missile stuff on North Korea in a rapid pace too, amazing. So I will just shift gear a little bit and talk about some of the concerns I have. I think that might be useful. But I want to start out by saying I think the nuclear posture review correctly points out that North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons capability first and foremost pose a threat, a proliferation threat, dire, imminent proliferation threat is something that we've been working on, I think, so I'm glad that it pointed that out. And that threat obviously is more than nuclear, it's biological and chemical weapons proliferation as well. I'm sure most of you guys read that New York Times piece just yesterday or the day before yesterday talking about UN report linking North Korea's assistance to Assad's chemical weapons program. The nuclear posture review also talks about the capability about North Korea being months away from completing their program, meaning achieving the capability to attack mainland United States with nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile. Now, I think that's an aggressive timeline, but it's I think USIC, it's the Intelligence Community's assessment, as a CIA director, Mike Pompeo, I think recently talked about North Korea being months away. But in terms of actual implications to the North Korean crisis, I see two notable things from the nuclear posture review. And the first notable detail is, I'm sure what you guys discussed first session on the sea-launched cruise missile to be developed in the next few years and as a personal deterrent against the Kim Jong-un regime. And while it's not explicitly linked to the North Korean crisis, it had Russia in mind, because U.S. could then place nuclear weapons on destroyers or submarines in the Sea of Japan, giving U.S. military access to lower yields nuclear warheads on the order of those that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, without having to base them in South Korea, and it provides benefits and so on. And I understand that the prompt response and secondary benefit of increased credibility and extended deterrence for our allies to dissuade Japan and South Korea from the need to develop their own nuclear weapons themselves. But I just want to sort of talk about the risk, just because I just want to talk about the North Korean perspective, because my biggest concern when it comes to North Korea right now is potential for spiral in escalation due to miscommunication. So what I'm really concerned about is first strike incentives, particularly on North Korea. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, because second notable detail that I noticed from the nuclear posture review is, when the review talks about this extreme circumstances. I'm sure it came up about whether it's broadened the extreme circumstances or not when they clarified it, because they give out these examples of extreme circumstances when the U.S. will use nuclear weapons. But of course, the risk and the downside of that, again, is from North Korean perspective, if Kim Jong-un believes that we are about to attack North Korea. I mean, that has been my main concern, because I've had my interactions with North Koreans. I've, for example, met with North Koreans last summer, and when we were talking about nuclear weapons, it came up when they said, North Korea is not going to use nuclear weapons, but as you mentioned, if they believe the attack is coming their way, if there's a regime change or regime decapitation or any kind of attack that's going to happen on North Korea. North Koreans themselves have told me, we didn't pursue nuclear weapons at this great cost, going through all this isolation, sanctions, and everything else, just to perish without using them. And I believe them. It's a little bit of a scary thought, but I came away absolutely believing that. So I am concerned about that, particularly because, and I'm not a technical person, but because of this debate about whether this low-yield sea launch capability creates discrimination problem, right? I'm concerned that miscalculation by North Korea could be high. And another concern that I have is, nuclear posture review is sort of an aspirational thing that I think we talked about this earlier. It's kind of goals, but nuclear crisis occurring right now with North Korea. So so I feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect there. This is not 5 years down the road. This is this year. And whether it's North Korea is 90% done, 95% done, and whether they're months away from completing their program or not, it's something that I believe is going to unfold this year. I mean, soon, just because they are very close to completing the program. And from US policymakers' perspective, this is something that we have to handle. So this is not some future issue, but it's an issue right now. And you want to talk about a little bit decoupling. The problem is, I think the administration's perspective on North Korea is, what is their intent? Can we ultimately, at the end of the day, after sanctions and everything, after we pursue this pressure policy, what are we ultimately prepared to do? Are we going to live with nuclear North Korea, or are we not going to live with nuclear North Korea? And I think there are those that are arguing right now in the administration that we cannot live with nuclear North Korea for a whole host of reasons. And you talked about decoupling. One of the reasons is because we believe that those people who believe that we cannot live with nuclear North Korea believes that North Korea has more of offensive intent to acquiring nuclear weapons. It's not only for regime survival, it's not only as a nuclear deterrent against the United States, but because they have a greater design of trying to decouple US-South Korea alliance, try to kick the US forces off the Korean peninsula, perhaps try to achieve unification on its own terms over the long term. Because of this offensive intent, there are those who are making this argument that we have to handle this problem. And this is why you hear administration talking about if the first phase of sanctions does not work, we have to move into the second phase. And what is that second phase? So again, I think this all in all looks good. But my concern is this is sort of a future product, and the crisis is occurring right now. So,
thank you for that. All right, well, there is clearly a lot on the table.
Can I add one point on the Korea strategy discussion?
Go ahead.
It seems to me that the administration's choice to emphasize the risk of intent creates a serious crisis destabilization problem, because I'd be interested, Sue and Ankit, in your judgment about whether, if we were genuinely going to pursue a preventative strike policy against North Korea, I'd love to know your assessment of whether the South Koreans would support it. Because my guess is that
0% possibility.
My guess is that at the height of the crisis, our closest ally would defect, and that's the comparison to the Europe challenge, right? The Berlin crisis. Germans weren't willing to carry out our strategy, and we had to recalibrate. And I think we are likely, because of the policy the White House has adopted on it, to be very much at risk if a crisis should get started, that we can't carry the Japanese and the South Koreans with us on the policy we're going to pursue.
I 100% agree.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You're nodding, right?
No, there's a 0% possibility that the Moon Jae-in government will support any kind of preventive strike against North Korea.
So I want to ask a couple of questions of both sides. I've got a couple of ideas, but I think this has teed up, so I'm actually going to turn to you all first. And really, my questions are about almost exactly on this issue. The first question I have, and I'm actually going to ask them both, because I think you might want to think about them together. The fundamental question is, should we establish a more stable deterrence relationship with North Korea? Is it viable? Is it possible? And even if it is possible, is it a good idea? They're not necessarily the same question. I'm not saying it's desirable. I'm not suggesting, we wouldn't all prefer other alternatives. But Is it achievable? And is it a good idea? Here's my second question. It really has to do with this first strike incentive problem and the concern that we might find ourselves in one of these high situations. In other words, high first strike incentives potentially on both sides of a conflict. And what's interesting is what makes that situation feel particularly scary, I think is the right word. They're in a breakout phase. They're running for the finish line. So time is short. And unlike what we're going to be describing over here, we don't have decades of experience managing this dialogue, and we have zero mechanisms to communicate effectively in a crisis. Maybe that's a loaded question, maybe I think I know what I think, but what can we do? So what can we do to be more stable and have a deterrence relationship that has a chance of reducing the risk of nuclear conflict? And related to that, in the near term, how can we manage our way out of what appears to be a nearly imminent nuclear crisis? Who wants to go first?
I can start.
All right.
So this is trial number 3, like I said, with an adversary that has these capabilities. The first 2 times, we managed to establish stable deterrent relationships that persist to this day. Part of the reason none of us have any experience fighting nuclear wars. I think, we hear this, that, the idea of Kim Jong-un, what does he want out of his nuclear weapons? Does he covet territory? Does he covet the unification of the peninsula on his own terms, either in the short term or the long term? Only he knows how healthy he is, how long he'll live. What does he want to accomplish by the time he grows old in North Korea? Does he want to be the member of the Kim family to unite the country, and does he see nuclear weapons as his way to do that? The questions we asked, for example, when Mao acquired nuclear weapons were remarkably similar to the questions that we're talking about now, these debates that we have about what does Kim Jong-un want. We had plenty of reasons to point at Mao Zedong as being a irrational, undeterrable individual. That we hear similar arguments being made today about Kim Jong-un. But at the end of the day, we were able to establish a stable relationship with China, and part of that, there is this idea of mutual vulnerability that we haven't admitted to the Chinese yet. We haven't necessarily even admitted that to the Russians yet. If you look at the nuclear posture review, at least, for the North Koreans, I think what would help stabilize things. They're very clear, and so you've probably heard this when you've spoken to them. But they now talk about this idea of seeking a balance of power with the United States. They're seeking the benefits of the nuclear revolution first and foremost, which is that they're seeking security for the regime. That is, I think, the proximal goal. And I think there are interesting debates to be had about North Korea's coercive intentions with nuclear weapons. For example, I think last year in August, when they threatened to bracket Guam with 4 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, unless the United States, stopped its B-1 flights to the Korean Peninsula. I mean, that's a classic example of a nuclear state using some kind of compelling threat. Right? We will do this unless you stop doing this. And obviously the United States didn't succumb to that threat, and there's questions about how credible that North Korean threat was. There was a lot of misstatement that North Korea had walked that threat back when, in fact, it remains on the table to this day. It's all they said was Kim Jong-un would give the order if he felt the need to do that. So all of that is to say, I mean, there are things that we can do with North Korea to make this a less dangerous situation, to reduce their incentives, first of all, for a first strike. But right now, you're right, we're in this breakout period, maybe 18 months or 2 years from July 4th when we saw that first ICBM is how long it's going to take for both sides to figure out some kind of modus vivendi around this new nuclear situation. But that's not to say that things aren't quite dangerous right now.
I think I do believe, I'm one of those people, I do believe that North Korea has more coercive intent. It does make sense. Why wouldn't North Korea, if they can do it, get the U.S. force, kick off the U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula? It's practical. If you can decouple your South Korea alliance, that's great. But we don't need to let that happen. So the idea that we need to make a preventive strike, we can't just not let North Korea make us leave. I mean, so I don't understand why that's linked. I don't understand why acknowledging North Korea's more aggressive intent is linked to, therefore we have to take preventive action. containment and deterrence did work with North Korea since the Korean War. I mean, they did sing Cheonan, they did blow up. I mean, but all in all, I think I would argue that containment and deterrence did work. And just the idea of taking a preventive strike, it's like I think all of us would agree, it would have catastrophic consequences. Forget about even nuclear weapons, just conventional artillery alone. I mean, 14,000 conventional artillery pieces within 60 seconds of Seoul. So that doesn't, just because you acknowledge aggressive intent, I just don't see that necessarily that we therefore have to take preventive action. I do think our only solution, I don't see North Korea giving up nuclear weapons. I do think the sanctions and pressure is the right way to go. And I think combined with that, we have to come out with a more robust deterrence and containment strategy, including missile defense, greater alliance coordination, and trilateral U.S., South Korea, and U.S. coordination, and continue this effort. And I don't buy this timeline that we have months to figure this out. I think we can calm ourselves and continue on this path. And North Korea, Kim Jong-un is not suicidal. This guy is about regime survival and regime preservation. And we can just take a breather and go on with the deterrence containment strategy and have a longer term view on things.
Can I just press you both on the question of controllability? This issue of, are there some things we could do to improve our crisis management posture? Are there risks associated with that? They really have no crisis communication mechanism with them. Can you just touch on that?
Well, I do believe we do need to, I mean, I'm not necessarily a let's negotiate with North Korea right now, particularly when they're not willing to give up nuclear weapons. But I do think establishing some sort of hotline is important. I mean, even at the height of the Cold War, I think we had that kind of communication with Soviet Union to just de-escalate and be able to just deconflict and just make sure that we're not miscommunicating. And we don't have that really, and we had very low level with the New York channel. But now that Ambassador Jo Yoon has left, we don't even have a replacement for him. We don't have ambassador to South Korea. We don't really have any kind of level of communication with North Korea. So I do think establishing that is priority number one.
Also, I mean, we heard a bit about ambiguity versus clarity. I think clarity is absolutely necessary right now. And this is the challenge that we're about to face with the alliance, is that this is going to be the first mass mobilization, full eagle exercise that the United States and South Korea will be conducting since North Korea introduced a thermonuclear ICBM to the peninsula. So how do you go about that without necessarily, raising North Korea's? I mean, the North Koreans are about, I guarantee a month from now, if you read, Nodong Shinmun, their state media, that they'll be, foaming at the mouths about these exercises and issuing nuclear threats. They'll say that, we'll turn Washington, D.C. into a sea of fire. They may release propaganda videos. So how do you go about that without leading to some kind of deadly miscalculation? And I think the right thing for the United States to do is just to speak quite clearly. I mean, this old language that the Obama administration used, the Bush administration used, that we will use nuclear weapons first to defend our allies, but also if North Korea were to ever use nuclear weapons, that there would be no question that the regime can survive, that is the end of the North Korean regime. So the NPR actually does reaffirm that, and it reaffirms that the United States is ready to hit a range of targets in North Korea. But I think that kind of language, as long as the North Koreans take that as a credible posture for the United States, I think that's likely. And the way that gets damaged is when we hear sort of confusing signals that if North Korea makes threats, that there will be fire and fury. I think that, I mean, look, for us here, I mean, we sort of know how to tell policy apart from sort of off-the-cuff presidential remarks or potentially tweets. For the North Koreans, I think that's a lot less clear. They're used to seeing American presidents speak in a certain way, and I think they take those very seriously. So that would be my, the bottom line is establish absolute clarity from the President of the United States downwards on what our North Korea policy is, and specifically when it comes to employing nuclear threats. Because the North Koreans do see the United States, they do see us as nuclear coercers on their own. That's how we're viewed in Pyongyang. And for us to do that effectively, to deter them, there has to be absolute clarity.
All right, thank you. Well, let me turn to you all with a couple of questions as well. And they're less related, my two questions, but I think you can kind of chew on them together. The first, no surprise. I have to ask you to talk about President Putin's speech and the announcement of the 4 capabilities. But in particular, I guess I'd like your take on is this continuity or change? How much continuity and change is going on the Russia side of the equation? Do you see this? Do you think there's anything to this being somewhat reactive to things we've done? Do you think it was just opportunistic to kind of take the opportunity after the NPR? Help us contextualize from your perspectives what that means. So that's very much kind of my first question. My second question you both touched on, but I think it's important to dig into it a little bit. And that goes into what does it take to really keep our European allies on board? And Corey, it may be a little bit more for you. I mean, it sounds like you're hearing pretty positive messages about the NPR and its support for the alliance. I think I've heard, a couple of others have heard a few more warning signs. And some of those have to do with maybe the lightness of touch in the NPR on other priorities like arms control, nonproliferation, nuclear security, and the sense that those things are actually very important to those allies for helping to maintain the balance with their publics and others to kind of for them, it's like a yin-yang thing where they really, in my experience, they kind of need both to kind of maintain the consensus. And so they're a little worried. So that's sort of like the bad news part. The good news part, though, is I think they all feel, for the most part, what I'm hearing, it could have been so much worse. There was no call for additional testing. We, kind of did more of the right things in terms of not stepping away from INF. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So maybe if you touch on that one first, and then we'll get to what do we think about what Putin had to say.
So I agree with nobody should have expected it to be anywhere near this good, and especially where arms control is concerned. Right? That they lay out the charge sheet of Russian violations. They make clear the United States is in compliance with all of our obligations. It makes clear that it keeps the negative security guarantee. It lists in great detail the different agreements and where we stand on them. So, and I didn't see any changes in there from anything in the Obama nuclear posture review. Elaine, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the continuity, Europeans ought to take that as an enormous victory. And the only challenge that will come, I think, is the same challenge that came with the national security strategy. It's so sensible, it's so reasonable. Is there any likelihood the president will actually be governed by this? And I think that's the right question to ask in the Trump administration. But just one more thing, Frank, which is that it takes arms control seriously as an integral part of the nuclear undertaking. And frankly, I don't think Europeans can ask for anything better than that. And that if the administration had gone too far, as all of you know, because you guys always deal with allies as well, right? Like, you never hit the Goldilocks spot. They're never, if you're too much on arms control, they think you're not taking their defense seriously, especially given Russian behavior and these exercises of nuclear use. So I actually think the Trump administration did a terrific job in taking allied concerns seriously and taking arms control seriously. The one place I think could be trouble, and Frank, you would know better than I, the one thing I think could be trouble is the non-proliferation treaty.
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about.
I could see this getting tangled up.
Yeah. Why don't we stick on that, and then we'll come back to the Putin question.
I think Corey did a very nice job. I mean, that's my general assessment as well. No new administration, given this security environment, was going to begin negotiating new arms control agreements. However, as Corey notes, it is pretty good on arms control. It maintains our negative security assurance. It keeps us in the New START treaty. One of the things I was very concerned about early on is that this administration might exit the New START treaty, but it keeps us in, and it continues to fund the Comprehensive Treaty Test Ban Treaty Organization, the International Monitoring System, and the International Data Center, all associated with the CTBT. Now, this administration is not going to move towards ratification of the CTBT, but quite frankly,
it says that.
yeah,
in the posture review,
but quite
flat out.
frankly, I wouldn't expect a Republican administration to do that. But the bottom line is they've kept the funding. And I really take your point about how you have to look at arms control and deterrence as complementary. I think one of the reasons why arms control is in the state that it is over the last 25 years or so, we have let these two very, very important concepts diverge. Arms control, in my view, needs to be about promoting stability, preventing miscalculation. We've been too focused on the reduction. So I think there is definitely a role for arms control going forward, but if we are going to restore bipartisan consensus in the United States, we are going to have to make the argument, and proponents of arms control need to do this, that this is not necessarily about reductions. Reductions that are in a way, done in a way that enhances deterrence and stability, I think is good. But that should not be our driver. Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft had a very good piece a couple of years ago, and I think, Frank, you may have helped them, but it really talks about the importance of linking arms control objectives with our overarching security objectives.
Thank you. Okay, so help us know what to think about.
Want to start?
I think we may be flattering ourselves by suggesting that the Putin Sturm-und-Drang speech was actually a reaction to the nuclear posture review. My guess is it's probably a reaction to the coming presidential election, that he's running on a strength and security and Russia's back kind of platform. So if anything, the specific comment about a nuclear cruise missile that can 50,000 miles and it's nuclear power, all that spiffiness, that actually didn't strike me as particularly out of character, out of line, this is a continuation of a corroding, weakening Russia playing a bad hand extraordinarily adroitly.
Yeah, I would just only add one point on to what Corey had to say. I mean, despite the fact that we have reduced the role of nuclear weapons in our defense policy, it's been the exact opposite with Russia. And the analogy I like to use, if you look at Russia's overarching strategic situation over the long term, it's not a very good position. They are losing population. They don't have a modern 21st century economy. They have no real allies besides Assad, but he's not the most reliable ally. Their conventional capabilities have gotten better, but they're not on par with the United States. And then on their southeastern flank, they have this big and expanding China. Now, I understand Russia and China have a strategic partnership, but let's remember that strategic partnership is about one thing: balancing American power. So when you take this overarching strategic situation into consideration, what do the Russians have long term to maintain their security? And that is nuclear weapons. I remember at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference back in 2015, I was meeting with one of my Russian colleagues, and he looked at me and he said, "Frank, I fear a world without nuclear weapons." And I think he was only being half facetious.
All right. So I like the idea of the reassurance, but it sounds like of the 4 capabilities that were announced and the whiz-bang gadgets that were described, you're sort of, we can take it in stride?
My view is this: as long as we move forward with the modernization of our strategic nuclear deterrent, we should be able to deter any threat from Russia.
I completely concur with Frank.
Well, on that note, I'm going to open up to
Can I just
some
offer
questions. A quick one, because we've got to get some of the audience in. You want to work it
Sure.
in?
No, just to offer a slightly contrarian point. I mean, a lot of these systems, what struck me about the capabilities, at least we saw with these 4 systems, is that each one of them, I think, brought something to the table that suggested that the Russians were worried about U.S. missile defense capabilities.
Yeah,
That's a great point.
I don't disagree with that. You know, I've spent the majority of my career talking to the Russians on missile defense. I've heard every conspiracy theory. They believe it. And I very much hope that in its missile defense review, the administration makes it very, very clear that our missile defenses are not about Russia. From what I've seen to date, on the White House website, in the national security strategy, that is the focus of the U.S. missile defense program, is to deal with threats from North Korea and potentially Iran. But there's been some talk out there about potentially redirecting our missile defenses against Russia. I don't think that is a wise idea for a couple of reasons. Most importantly, if the Russians believe that we are really moving forward with missile defenses directed against them, you can be assured they will do whatever is necessary to maintain an assured strike capability against the United States. These guys don't do many things well, but they do know how to build advanced missiles and advanced countermeasures. So again, that's my recommendation to the new team. Whether they take that recommendation, we'll have to see.
Okay, very good. Well, we've got a little bit of time to take in some questions. I'll be heading over here. I'll take this one on the right. I've got a few of you clustered over here. But the gentleman in the front row, for starters, I saw that hand first. And then we'll have one over here, Bernadette. We have the far side. I will ask that you please state your name and your affiliation. Keep your point extremely brief, and I'll ask those of us on the panel to not all want to answer every question as well. Okay, to you, sir, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Satoshi Nishida from Happy Science in Japan. According to some survey conducted by one of the biggest survey companies in Japan, nearly 40% of American people support the idea of accepting nuclear weapons in North Korea, and in return, they support the idea of accepting the nuclearization of Japan and North Korea for deterrence. So, what is your perspective on this idea? Thank you.
Okay, and what I might do is take a couple, and we'll see. So let's try over here.
Hello, my name is Vyacheslav Kosrev. I'm from Russian Embassy, and a lot was said today about my country, and with a lot I may disagree. And but what is the most important is that our military doctrine says, and by the way, the president, Mr. Putin.
This is going to be a question, right?
No, it would be very, very not short, but comments, but very.
No, very short, because I will
try to make
question.
it sure. Yes,
so please
short as
form
possible.
to a quick question, or else I'm going to turn to someone
and
else.
The president underlined that it's once again that there are only 2 simple scenarios when we may use nuclear arsenals, and those scenarios are 100% defensive. And once again, the president said that we are not threatening anyone, and the young man told hypothetical scenarios. Yes. And with regard to Mr. Rowe's comments about Russia's reaction to the NPR, indeed, the American document is very concerning and disappointing, especially in the part of justifying a lower threshold of use of nuclear weapons, and by making groundless accusation of Russia. And I would like to remind that we do not have deployed tactical weapons, and we do not train our militias people to use them, while United States has already tactical weapons in Europe, contrary to the NPT. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm actually going to, since I don't think that will engender much response, I'm going to turn over here. Well, we can respond, but I want to get an actual question.
Hi, I'm Gilbert Brown, a nuclear engineering professor, so this is not my main subject in nuclear. But I wonder if North Korea in particular, and in this review, non-state actors become a different kind of risk.
Okay. All right. So I think
we're used to the mad approach to big guys, big weapons, but
so that's something that hasn't come up. But in the last review, a lot more of attention to nuclear terrorism, non-state actors, somewhat less emphasized here. So we can touch on that as well in terms of both areas. Why don't we, in terms of the first question, why don't I head over here and we'll give a quick response?
I guess the question is, you said 40% of Americans supported North Korea being nuclear, but also South Korea and Japan going nuclear, is that right? Yes, so obviously, even the last 2 years, there are, even in South Korea, there were some voices that talked about bringing tactical nuclear weapons back. So one of the negative consequences of North Korea being nuclear and us accepting that would be potential regional proliferation. But I think this is where extended deterrence comes in. If South Korea and Japan 100% believe in nuclear extended deterrence, that we have their back, I think we can mitigate that.
The one other point I would take from that poll, which I always think polls of American public attitudes on sophisticated international security issues aren't particularly reliable, not only because 40% of Americans can't put Canada on a map, but also because I do a lot of survey research on civil military issues, and it comes through very strongly that we are a public easily persuaded to go to war, easily persuaded to defend friends and allies that we like. And so what people say from a cold start is very often not what they will say if the president invests the time and the political capital to make the case for why we should do something.
Just responding to our colleague from the Russian embassy, what I would say is Russia is directly responsible for the security situation we find ourselves in. Their threats to use nuclear weapons against U.S. allies, their violation of the INF Treaty, their illegal occupation of Ukraine, and their direct meddling in the U.S. presidential election. However, all that said, I think we need to maintain dialogue with the Russians on strategic issues.
Sounds like your mic is going on.
Not necessarily to negotiate new arms control agreements, but to, one, look for mutual ways to reduce risk, and it would help if Russia stopped threatening to use nuclear weapons on other nations, and secondly, to send very strong deterrent messages so Russia truly understands what we are trying to do and understand that we will respond to threats against the United States and our allies.
Okay, thank you.
There was a question.
Yes, on the non-state actors.
Yeah, just real quickly on the non-state actors issue. So North Korea, for what it's worth, senior North Korean officials have specifically made assurances that they would never transfer a nuclear device to a non-state group. Granted, we have seen that North Korea is willing to do business with anyone and everyone for the right price. Right. So I'm not going to say that I don't think about that. It is a concern. We don't have any credible evidence that they have, there have been any failed kind of deals, there have been any transfers. We don't know anything about that. The place where I worry about that the most continues to be Pakistan. Last year, they started putting their nukes on submarines, and that brings together kind of mating issues. We've seen the Pakistani Navy attacked by al-Qaeda militants in 2014. And a recent book that came out actually by Steve Cole makes the argument that that frigate that was attacked in 2014 had a nuclear warhead on board. I'm not sure about that, but details like that worry me. And Pakistan is the primary situation where I see a non-state group potentially getting its hands on nuclear materials or weapons.
Okay, very good. I think I have time to take two quick questions. Let me see. I'm trying to see a hand. Okay, I've got one right here.
Thank you. My name is Maggie Feldman-Pilch. I'm from Unicorn Strategies. And my question is, given that this was a better NPR than we all kind of had expected, what is one thing you would have liked to see that wasn't in it? And what is one thing we could have done without?
Fantastic question. All right. And then, okay, I'll take one from this side over here.
Hello, Alicia Dressman, independent consultant. This question is for Corey. I want to know what indicators you use to determine European, when I say this, this is a little bit, obviously Germany isn't all of Europe, but I'm really talking about Germany in this case, to measure their support of the NPR and its objectives. To give you just a perspective very quickly here, when we proposed in a House resolution the deployment of INF missiles and looking into opening up an R&D program for that, and I was looking at the German press to see if any reaction there, I didn't see it, right? So it doesn't seem like there's a lot of very active interaction with U.S. policy in German press all of the time. How then do you determine if they're responding positively or negatively to, say, what would come out in the NPR? Thank you.
Excellent question, a methodological question. The answer is talking to Germans, seeing whether they've been consulted about the policy, whether they think it's going to be problematic for the government, whether they think there will be parliamentary reaction to it. So that was my research based on that. And Maggie Caroline, your fantastic question, my friend. I think the one thing I wish wasn't in it was so much concern that North Korea crossing the nuclear threshold requires some new kind of action from us, because I think we've actually had the right asymmetric threat, and that it has served to deter the North Koreans for a very long time, which is that any attack on the United States or its allies will result in a military response that the North Korean leadership will not survive. I think we have been focused much too much on preventing their acquisition rather than diminishing the political value to them of their acquisition by saying this doesn't change anything. It doesn't change anything about our commitment to the South Koreans. It doesn't change anything about our commitment to Japan. It doesn't change anything about our willingness to fight North Korea.
Okay. Well, I think we've got a bit on the Maggie Caroline's question. It's a great way to kind of wrap up the panel. So what was your answer?
I would say the declaratory policy. The Obama administration did not get everything right in their 2010 NPR, but one of the things I thought they got right was declaratory policy. One of the things I do think they got right was the declaratory policy. I think by adding those additional caveats in the declaratory policy, the administration opened itself up to criticism that they really didn't have to need to do. And I think as a result, they're going to be spending a lot of more time trying to explain that. So that's the one thing where I would have preferred them to just stick with the Obama administration policy, because I think we essentially got it right.
Okay.
Right. So
you can feel free to say the one good thing too.
Yeah.
She did ask both sides of the question.
Oh, that's,
I think it looks pretty good, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
That's true. I guess I agree with Corey on the North Korea point. I think the long-term strategic challenge in Asia remains China. And on that note, I guess what I would have liked to see, and this is kind of setting aside the fact that this is an NPR coming out of a Republican administration, but I think generally the idea of acknowledging mutual vulnerability, I think that matters quite a bit for China, matters quite a bit for stability with China, especially with Russia. That's a different question just given the strategic relationship, but I think acknowledging a degree of mutual vulnerability to Chinese weapons, acknowledging that missile defense, again, like China, like Russia, is for limited threats, which the NPR does say it's for limited threats, but the upcoming MDR, there's some questions there. So I think that's what I would like to see. I think what's a good thing is that we got the deterrence language on North Korea right, basically, and that actually matters quite a bit in a nuclear posture review, specifically released in early 2018, after we come out of this period of destabilizing language flying both ways. So that was good.
Okay, good.
I liked sort of listing of what makes North Korea really a threat, including the proliferation threat, and explaining that. I do agree on the declaratory thing, just because that I don't like that. I think we could have done without, just because I think it feeds to Kim Jong-un's paranoia, and that he may, again, mistake some action from us as something that we're going in for a full-on conflict, and that will lead to escalation. So I think we could have done without. They are deterred, so I don't think there was an unnecessary step.
All right. Very good. Well, I think the first panel sort of threw it down and said balanced range of perspectives, smart views, and truly wonky. And you guys stepped up and absolutely delivered on all counts as well. So please, before we join in thanking the panelists, I just want to remind you we will take a very brief break, not even to go outside, but just to switch things up because we have Chairman Thornberry who's going to be speaking to you in moments. And so we'll do that. And of course, we have a reception afterward that has kindly want to appreciate Northrop Grumman and the support they've given to us. So please feel free to join us at the end. You'll have more time to ask questions. With that, join me in thanking our panelists.
Long day, so it must be a very good session. I'm delighted that you're all here, but I understand why too, that it's a unique opportunity for all of us to hear from Chairman Thornberry. I think the first time we met, Chairman, we were talking about Pantex, and he had a more narrow interest in Pantex back then, because obviously it's district, but he's gotten a much broader field of view now about all things nuclear, and we've had a fascinating conversation just now while we were waiting for the room to get reconfigured. This is a chairman that has to be responsible for so many things these days that stretch across the landscape of security policy, but he continues to give unusual focus for this very important issue. For many, many years, we've rather drifted intellectually on the question of nuclear policy. The chairman has not. He's been there. He's now ready to help the rest of us get up to speed, and we're going to hear some of that tonight with his remarks. And so would you please, with your applause, welcome the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry.
Well, thank you, John. And I will say I very much appreciate all of the work that CSIS is doing and has done on the issue of strategic deterrence and other aspects of national security as well. And I also appreciate all the help, guidance, and wisdom you have given me from early days all the way through today. Look, I understand it's after 5 o'clock and y'all have heard from a number of leading experts. I got to hear a little bit of that earlier today. So subscribing to the view that it's often more important to be reminded of what you already know rather than educated about the obscure, I'm going to spend a few minutes just on the basics, at least my perspective of the basics, and necessarily, given my job, it's going to have somewhat of a more political tint to it, not a partisan, but the political system tint to it, about strategic deterrence and some of the implications. Like any good preacher, I've got 3 points. Number one is that our nuclear deterrent has for 70 years and remains the cornerstone of our national security efforts. Number two, we've got a lot of work to do to ensure that our nuclear deterrent continues to perform its vital mission. And number three, this nuclear posture review moves us in a good direction that will ultimately, I think, be helpful. Okay, number one, it's the cornerstone. You know, you hear stuff like that a lot, those sorts of phrases, but just passing off a label doesn't really tell you about why it's important. I think of a house, and I think of a foundation upon which you can build all sorts of interesting specialized rooms and do all sorts of things there. But when the foundation crumbles, then all the marble countertops and all the fancy wallpaper and all the expensive furniture really doesn't matter much. When the house, they all become pretty worthless. And so for 70 years, the most serious existential threat to the United States has been a nuclear attack against our homeland. Deterring that attack has been the essential foundation upon which the rest of our defense efforts depend. Because if we don't do that, then nothing else that we are doing in defense matters very much. It's the foundation, the cornerstone of what else we do. And kind of like the foundation of our house, it's under there and we tend to take it for granted. And we tend to neglect it, which is somewhat understandable when success is defined by never having to use it.